sophisticated sort of thinker.
Yeah.
It looks like this particular terminology had been sort of in currency at some point. Now, Smith's obviously come across a few old books that use this particular piece of currency about societies. Now, the point he made about Christianity here is you have two extremes in a culture. One is culture where the rules and controls and everything becomes so thick and heavy that it becomes Byzantine. It strangles a culture, so to speak, deadens a culture. The other extreme is where it becomes too loose that the bits at the periphery start flying off as individual pieces.
Yes.
Isn't that a problem? I mean, in physics, in terms of establishing orbit, I mean, like, you have to find that balance, right?
Right.
I mean,
Right.
and it's a very delicate balance in a way, you know? I mean, it's not so delicate because, like, the moon is in orbit, it's actually drifting away. So there's some leeway, but you know, once you reach escape velocity, then it's like, then you can't come back unless you have some reverse thrust of some sort. So.
Now, just remember, I must warn you all at this point, that decline of civilization purely applies to those older, sillier civilizations in the past, like the Romans, not to us. We're the smart ones, which are going on linear progress that will never fail.
That's right.
Well, thank you for your assurance.
Well, I can see that while I missed the last session, Stephen learned nothing from it.
Oh?
No.
I was going to say the opposite. He's all over this.
Well, he's right about the attitude of modernity.
Yes.
Not about whether it too shall pass.
No, I thought you meant he learned nothing from it because we didn't have a last session.
Well,
so you can't learn anything.
I was off on a trip Valentine's Day, so
yeah.
But I did listen. It was quite a lively session on the 14th.
It was.
You know.
It was. I think today's going to be lively too. I mean, Stephen's put his finger right on the core concern of these next paragraphs in this chapter, which is this problem of, and this is an area that I've spent a lot of time on in my professional life, is the relationship between standardization and innovation. How do you relate? How do you come together as a people without choking out innovation and freedom? And in the modern world, as a law and order system of governance, we present them as opposites. That if you want to, that one comes at the expense of the other, that it's a spectrum and there's some kind of balancing act. But what I discovered in my professional career is that's a result of bad analysis. If you construct your system that way, you can create that conflict, and we have. But you can also structure it in such a way that what you standardize isn't what people do, but just some of the patterns that they follow. And then they can innovate within those patterns to their heart's content without breaking everything. This was what made the VA software cycle work. They, instead of having innovation and standardization at loggerheads with each other with a tug of war, they decoupled them from each other and made them orthogonal, so that you could standardize without in any way suppressing your capacity to innovate and try, to experiment, to try new things. But for that to work, it requires a really deep understanding of the possible pitfalls of both ends of the pseudo spectrum that we create. You have to know how you can go wrong with standardization. You have to know how you can go wrong with innovation. You have to understand that you need them both. They're both, it's like breathing and eating. You don't want to put them into opposition with each other. You want to arrange them so that you can do both of them, because you need both of them to survive as a civilization. And it can be done. We for decades before the VA, suffered agency capture by the Beltway, we were able to have a system in which people could innovate to their heart's content and follow standards at the same time. But, most systems of organization, people aren't thinking that that's even possible. And so when they set up their law and order systems or their standard systems or their centripetal forces, they do it in such a way that it always comes at the expense of freedom and innovation and experimentation. And that just sets in motion the tragedies that are going to play out over the next decades or centuries for that culture. So, but
I'm not sure if I totally agree with you because I'm thinking like part of the problem, and I don't mean to condemn it because I actually believe in it, is democracy. You have many, many opinions. And of course, you need to let those opinions develop itself. But I think there is a natural tendency in human beings to want to perhaps fight a little too hard for their own opinions against another. So as a result, I think unless you have some way to allow for the diversity, which is sort of like, like sort of what I call it, a sense of, well, I forgot the term, I'm getting old. But then it seems to me like it becomes eventually conflictual. I mean, I think you have to have people that allow for that, that diversity, to be able to have that diversity. Otherwise, if you have an authoritarian society, then I mean, everybody has to fall in line, which of course restricts it in a different way. But, I guess if you have like Plato's Republic and, the philosopher king could actually do the right job, then maybe you could find that balance in a way that you could have unity and diversity. I mean, that's always been a problem is conflict. The problem is when you get to a point in which it degenerates into this natural urge for a state of war. And I think, we're coming very close to that, not quite there yet, but pretty close, which is problematic.
This was Aristotle's critique, is that democracy isn't one thing, but it's two different governments. Mm-hmm. There's the democracy in which you agree on fundamental principles, and then you're free to do anything that you want, knowing that the principles will hold you together. And then there's the democracy in which we pretend that it's possible to have a society of people who agree on nothing. So some people think that you should eat people, and some people don't think you should eat people, and we think we can make a civilization out of that. And the Greeks said, no, there are some fundamental principles you have to sort out, because if some of you think that others are disposable, that's not freedom of speech. That's not healthy diversity of opinion. That is a society that's already divided against itself and going to tear itself to pieces.
But don't you think, I mean, one of the problems I have with religion, when you think about religion, its core principles, I mean, what should be its core principle is a kind of ethical principle. But the problem is most human beings, I might include myself in that, is that ideas themselves have to be objectified. And, in the sense that it manifests in some kind of form that is sort of like an object of sorts. And once you begin to do that, then in a sense, the objectification of it becomes a kind of formal religion that is very sticky. It attaches all sorts of things that didn't belong to the central core, and you believe that that is part of the core. And that's why you have religious conflicts, because each religion, although the central core is about ethical behavior, is that each one has stuck on different things that has become his thing, so which is not the original thing. So how do you do that when people need, like the cross or, a bull or whatever it is to objectify the concept because it's just too difficult for most people to live in abstraction. And so that's always a problem. And since you have a society, they have to, in a sense, achieve a degree of understanding. If it's not an intellectual understanding, at least a kind of empathy of some sort, right? Mm-hmm. Which then becomes, you can't differentiate the core from the stickiness.
I'd note here the parallel with the problem that naive gnosis in the form of Dulea and naive noesis in the form of Banausea feel like the only two choices to the people who are in them. And to somebody captured by one or the other gravity well, it feels like the only choice. There is this natural antagonism in the worldviews to each other that leads people to feel like only one or the other is possible in a life. And it's why Hegel talks about Vernunft as being different in kinds, because to reconcile the two different modalities of thought in a way that doesn't set them into opposition with each other, but that actually harnesses them both for a complete full life, requires thinking outside the framework of either one. And for us, the challenge is, well, what could that framework possibly be? If these are the two baseline, faculties of the metabolism of the mind, that's all we've got to work with. How can you think of something that can't be expressed by either one of them? And that's where the negation of the negation, the search outside ourselves for principles, to let ourselves be guided by something other than these two pools of interpretation, becomes the challenge. And anybody who hasn't done the work to free themselves from those isn't really capable of even conceiving of what it would be like to think in a way that wasn't Dulic or wasn't Banausic. They seem like the only choices. This is how it is with all of these big, what do I want to say, racks, like being stretched on a rack, tortured, pulled, like the Procrustean bed. All of these poles that yank on each other and encourage us to think of them as two binary choices, either or, true or false. We have to have one or the other. They all set up traps for the mind that prevent us from getting out of them by seeming to rule out any possible reconciliation of the two. And so our problem as moderns is we have been acculturated to be entirely possessed by those binary ways of thinking about these choices. And it's part of why, for example, I'm confident that if I'd not actually lived through the golden age of Vista in the VA and seen and lived for myself the way that standardization and innovation can be decoupled, I never could have imagined it. I couldn't have thought it was possible because everything up until then had taught me that these are in opposition to each other and that you can't have them both.
Well, your explanation reminds me, and I'm not sure if I got it right because I'm not that deep of a scholar, about Plato. I guess the metaphor is the chariot. The intellect is, in a sense, teaming the two horses, right? Mm-hmm. And that its responsibility is somehow to make the two horses work together, rather than pulling apart, because the chariot is never going to go in the right way. So it just seems to me like there is the third, if you want to put it in that metaphor, that in a sense is the, how should I say, the intelligent controller that allows the horses to do its thing, to exercise its spirit. And yet, on the other hand, they are somehow working as a team rather than, fighting against each other. So
yeah, it's a potent image, and it lets us sort of visualize a little bit this idea of what if the horses aren't pulling against each other? What if they're running in the same direction? The level of indoctrination we have in this culture into the law of the excluded middle makes it necessary that we hold up against that instinct of ours these kinds of potent images to help free the mind from being stuck in the track of thinking, well, they must be in opposition. It's like, well, but we can imagine horses that aren't fighting each other. We can imagine it. We can see a chariot going forward. It must be possible. Donald, go ahead. You got your hand up.
Yeah, I think it's also in the Plato in the Republic talks about the forms of government versus the contents of government. And that there are three forms, and these are kind of mathematical. There's rule of the one, the few, and the many. And that's all your choices.
Mm-hmm.
But there are tyrants and there are philosopher kings.
Mm-hmm.
Although it's not clear to me in the Republic that there's a unique ruler of the polis, that it's more philosopher kings, a council or something. There is oligarchies and sort of council of the elders, there.
Mm-hmm.
And Greece had its share of tyrannies. In fact, Athens fought tyrannies both before and after the Golden Age.
That's right.
So, and the other is, of course, the many, democracy, and as to whether they're an educated citizenry or a mob is up to the people. It's not up to the form. But Plato, I think, made the remark that strangely, democracy is kind of in the middle. It can't quite achieve the evil of a good tyranny, but it can't achieve the good of a philosopher king.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So he sort of says some nice things about democracy because it has a lot of potential to be okay and very stable. Not perhaps a just polis, which is what he's trying to talk about in the Republic, but I think he had, it's kind of surprising. People would say he automatically would dismiss a democracy, but he might also recognize that it has such, its strength is its inertia.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard. Maybe he just never knew a really good demagogue, but
they
the mob
had
is
their
there's a lot of mass there that needs to be moved in the demos. So that was just something. I did watch the last session,
Yeah.
the latest session, and I had some questions maybe for you.
Sure, shoot.
One, I really like this fact that one of the things that we need is an understanding, what he calls it incisive essentiality, that we know things in their essence.
Yes.
And so my question would be, and you see, Genothi Sioton, is there a human essence for us to know when we know ourselves? I say there is.
Yeah.
But if people want to think things I've never really sat down and discussed with Kenneth are that. So like if you took an heuristic personality from antiquity,
yeah,
from medieval ages and from modernity, and they all come to some good self-understanding that's not delusion and everything, would they have a lot to agree on this is the nature of man? This is man's essence. You take, easy questions for 100 there, Rick.
Oh my God. Putting easy next to that is
well. I actually think this is the crux of all philosophy.
Yes,
kind of, because as if when we all become heuristic and we all achieve that self-knowledge, if there aren't any two that agree, because we all have a different essence, then why are we in community?
Yeah.
Why do we even attempt politics in a broad sense, that living together?
So before I call on Stephen, I'd like to underscore just how profound the question you're asking is. It goes right to the heart of why modernity is an anti-philosophical system of relations. Because if we believe that people can be anything, if we believe, Pico, that we are an unfinished creature that can finish ourselves any way we feel like finishing ourselves, it says we have no essence, we have no character. We create it for ourselves, and we could have created it differently. And ergo, and this is the thing that moderns can't grasp because we're educated out of grasping it, ergo, that's not our essence, right? The idea of the essence of a thing is what goes to its roots. What is it, fundamentally? What are the constraints upon it that it cannot escape, that are core to its nature? And by believing that, by moderns believing that they have no constraints, that they can be anything, they fundamentally believe they have no essence. And therefore, they believe they have no character and they have no limitations, and they can, basically, they believe that they're self-willing gods. From a Greek perspective, the core myth of Pico is tantamount to saying that human beings are gods, that we have a godlike capability that the Greeks understood we absolutely do not have. And so the Greek concept of how you go about forming a culture and why and what philosophy is for is all driven from this idea that we do have a nature. It is just as binding upon us as the laws of gravity, and that it is incumbent upon us to understand what it is and to structure our lives and our civilizations and choices around those limitations to make up for the problems. But for a modern who believes they have no essence, who believes they are Proteus incarnate and we could be anything we want to be, we therefore believe there are no fundamental problems that culture needs to solve in order to get us out of the starting gate. So as a result, we don't solve any of the fundamental problems facing humanity because of our character. We just let those flourish to the full measure because we disbelieve in them. And as a result, we find ourselves constantly playing tug of war over our own societies. Because we've never bothered to agree on anything, including why we even got together in the first place.
Well,
we don't even agree about that.
Well, it's a good thing those old people thought of social contracts, something that free and radical wills can enter into, but then nobody ever again has to believe in them.
I mean, it really is just a fig leaf, right? The whole social contract notion, because for it to be a contract, that means you could have made a different choice. So if somebody in the past made a social contract saying, how about we don't murder each other and try to have a civilization? Well, the very next generation, if they see some practical advantage, could turn around and say, well, I choose not to participate in that contract. For it to be a contract, I must freely be able not to choose to engage in it. Ergo, I will exterminate you all. My people will be the dominant people. It's like literally we aren't agreeing about any of the fundamentals that make it possible to have a civilization.
Well, I think your answer sort of got it in one, as the British would say, and that when you go deeply into modernity, why is there even a society, yet alone an anti-culture? I mean, it's to paraphrase Leibniz, it's monads all the way down.
Right.
We're all autonomous individuals.
That's the belief system. That's the belief system that we can't question because it's baked into us from the get-go. And so the result is, and you'll see this critique in Kenneth Smith, once you know that this is his complaint, you see it in every sentence he writes about modernity. He's like, when you begin so incoherently, I mean, we when we went through the medieval world, we talked about the way that the quest for orthodoxy of the medieval church was doomed from the outset because they came out of the starting gate with 17 heresies side by side and declared one of them to be the orthodox one without ever reconciling the problem. And so they spent their entire epoch of 1,000 years struggling to suppress heresy until in the end, the orthodoxy was so corrupt that people chose anything except it, and it led to the Protestant Reformation. So, you have to envy those guys for only having 17 heresies side by side, because we came out of the starting gate with an infinite number of monads who don't agree about anything, including why we're doing any of this. And so as a result, all of the noble forms of our constitutions and our laws and our treaties and so on, with all their puffed up language, amount to a game of make-believe in which we pretend that we agreed about something when fundamentally we never did. It's what characterizes us as a people. And because we don't agree about anything, including whether children should be exploited, including whether other people should be exterminated, including, on and on and on, the whole list of all the fundamental things that are required to get together as a people, we agreed at the beginning never to agree about those things, and then we've incurred the liabilities of doing that. So I'm glad you brought that up, Donald. Stephen, and then MJ, and then Phil, I think. So go ahead, Stephen.
Well, you can see an element of the centripetal and centrifugal.
It's all over this.
In a culture when literally it starts to fly apart. The American Civil War is a case of a split where the differences began to fly apart. The fall of the Soviet Union was a process where the periphery started to break away. Mm-hmm. To the point where you had, a sort of demagogic capitalist guy in the out in Siberia trying to create his own state, and then you have Putin suddenly appears and he puts his foot down. So all that era of freedom in a sense is that situation where things might fly apart a bit. Now in the West, after the America's success in World War II, mm-hmm. and becoming the Western society rebuild itself as a successful society, and it was successful. And then you reach the 1980s where business has suddenly decided it's above the state, it's above society. We can do as we please. Greed is good. So we're sort of struck one of those phases where the financial and business culture suddenly decided it was a law unto itself, and that's continuing today.
Right.
Even Facebook saying, well, we're going to fact check everything. Right. Well, okay, it doesn't matter which side you're on, but okay, you decided you've taken on the role of the state.
Yes.
Because we are a power, we will take on the role of the state.
Yes. Yes.
And so that's another element where, you got Facebook has decided is diverging, is flying off in its own culture.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
But being modernism, it can't say we're going to fact check things responsibly. It has to say we're going to fact check things profitably. So we're going to fire all our fact checkers and we're going to replace them with algorithms that look for certain words and phrases. And those algorithms will decide whether or not what it is that you said and whether or not that violates our community conventions. So for example, I went along, for somebody who writes a lot of philosophical critiques
I
of
might
modernism.
add here, Facebook, that was the curious incident within the last few weeks when Facebook fact-checked the British Medical Journal.
Yes. That's even better than my
Facebook is
example.
the medical experts. Hey, man, we're
What do they
fact-checking
know?
you.
That's right. Well, in my example, I was shocked that it took me until this year to get on Facebook's watch list, because I write all these critiques, philosophical critiques. What they finally nailed me for was I shared the trolley problem, and they thought I was saying you should kill people. They put my account on warning for threatening the lives of imaginary people on the tracks of the trolley problem. And, I had to share it and say, is this not the height of absurdity? Facebook wants to nanny us by protecting us from killers, such as philosophers talking about right and wrong in ethics. What could be more dangerous than a philosopher? And on the one hand, I'm like, this is so off the rails, right? This is such an example of what happens when you try to use a computer algorithm to make judgments about meaning. But on the other hand, they did get it right. I am a philosopher, and that's a very dangerous thing. It's just they didn't cite any of my posts that critique the fundamentals of modernism. They cited this little thing because of the appearance of the word kill. It's like, oh, you said kill. You must be a killer. I'm like, so what you're saying, Stephen, is right on the nose, but you have to add the absurdity of not only are they trying to do it, but they're trying to do it in the most incompetent possible way, in which they will just reflexively react to words and phrases out of context without any sense of what they mean.
Okay, that's Les Allen's game there in his humanism ethics, which
Yeah.
what are you going to do? Which lever are you going to pull? I was hoping
Exactly.
to introduce some ants trailing along the rail, which has the fewer people on it. And what if you kill 100 ants?
You're right. My solution was, rather than kill one person on one track or 8 people on another track, you should kill the person who proposed the trolley problem so that you don't have to kill any people on any tracks. And they said, oh no, you're threatening the life of somebody. I'm like, oh, give me a break.
Jesus.
My God. Anyway, thanks, Stephen. I think it really underscores, yeah, you're right, that Facebook wants to govern us, even though, boy, are they not suited for it. And one questions, indeed, if one takes Kenneth Smith's critiques of modernism, one questions whether anything that is a modern government qualifies as competent to govern human beings. Is that, in fact, not actually its job? It's trying to govern abstract systems of rules and laws and make sure that all of the levers and pulleys move in the right ways, regardless of what people's human needs are, because that's what modern systems are good at. They're not good at human beings and meaning. MJ and then Phil. Go ahead, MJ.
Real quick. This is just from my perspective of as an amateur reader of philosophy.
Yeah, please.
But talking about philosophy for the moderns, just connecting dots.
Mm-hmm.
Sartre was the most perfect philosopher for moderns. Existence before essence. What could be more perfect for the modern?
Mm-hmm.
So that was just my connecting 2 dots. The other thing is connecting a dot on the trolley. I think there's this other little root thread that's going through, which is that these people, all right, the AI, the digital creator community now has got this bee in their bonnet that AI can think for us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the algorithms, it's like, the kid with the BASIC in his Commodore 64. I'm going to code a human. I'll put in all the logic. It's going to be great.
It's going to be great.
Yeah. So their extension is AI will think for us.
Right.
So I could go on all day, but that was it. Those are the 2 points.
Thanks, MJ. Yeah, I've been working in medical informatics, which is one of the more complicated areas of computer science, since 1984. Professionally, it's what I do for a living. And I love the work that's going into AI. but I wouldn't for a second confuse it with intelligence. It's like it has nothing to do with human intelligence. We're way before the baby steps stage of moving towards simulating human judgment. And one of the reasons for that is we don't understand human intelligence. Like we're still using the eugenicist Nazi, IQ as our notion of intelligence. We think intelligence could be summed up with a little number, and you have this number and that's how intelligent you are. And any experience with supposedly smart people from various walks of life, and you quickly figure out that they're smart about different things in different ways. And the same is with people that you think are stupid. You will discover they're smart about things in different ways too. And this notion that all that complexity can be represented with an integer, is still pretty close to the level of misunderstanding that we have. But from that beginning point, we think that we're going to simulate human intelligence. It's like, there's a reason why we can't write algorithms to do these things. We can't do them ourselves, even without having to explain it to a computer. When we look at the success of modern governments, it's a mess. Phil and then Joseph. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I'll just make this comment and transition and go to my other comment. I remember when I retired and came to California and lived with my family and my nephew in particular. We somehow at some point start talking about computer because he was into computer. He's kind of that generation. And finally I came to Facebook and I said, I refuse to go on Facebook. And I said, because part of the reason is because I don't trust Mark Zuckerberg. And he really got upset by that term, because I think there's something wrong with him as an ethical person. So that was my out. So, but he kind of disagreed. I think he's coming to my point. He was never really into Facebook, but he was trying to defend technology. My other thought was, like a couple of days ago, I attended a meetup on free will and morality. It was an interesting meeting. And this might actually address Donald's question about essence. And it proposed that one of the essence of human being is, for whatever reason, we want to be with each other. I mean,
yeah,
that creates the beginning of a society of groups of people, right? And out of that, actually, it proposed that that's where free will comes out and morality comes out, because you begin to see others and you begin to have to modify your behavior because you know that your actions have consequences for others. And if you want to be with them, then you have to actually make choices about those consequences that take them into account, these others, at least in various degrees. And that was, in a sense, the development of morality, because the free will, at the beginning, I said, have a society, you have to have free will. Even if you don't have free will, people who do the wrong thing will be punished, even if they say, hey, what determinism made me do, otherwise it wouldn't work. But this was actually a pretty reasonable explanation, because it was developmental in the sense, you started out probably with less of that cooperation. And then when you got more and more into it, the society got more complex. You have to develop more complex relationships. Mm-hmm. And it was interesting that choice came out of not like, oh, we started out with choice to begin with. Choice came out from the fact that you actually saw that there was consequences to others. And when there's consequence, you have to make a choice between A and B or C or D, right? It's like, otherwise, you just do what the hell you do. Right. And so I remember when somebody did something wrong, and I said, well, I'm not going to call them a heathen or that sort of thing. I just say that they're uncivilized because they don't understand the structure of civilization that requires that, right? They want to have the freedom to do what they want, but they don't realize that part of that freedom comes from the fact that they live in society. So they're free to walk around without being pounced upon by somebody else. Otherwise, you're not free. You're free in a sense to do whatever you want, but that freedom is restricted by misbehavior of others. So therefore, in a sense, you have to take that equation in the balance that in some ways you have to give up certain degree of freedom because of choices made in order to live in a civilized society. Otherwise, it's not that you're not intelligent, you're just uncivilized. You don't really want civilization. You just want it's like Hammurabi, like, oh, well, couldn't we just have the good stuff? And Hammurabi said, no, you got to have both the good stuff and the bad stuff because they're both part of the same coin. And so that I think that's kind of important to understand. And I think that actually address that issue, maybe existence does come before essence, because essence came out of the development of existence. So maybe they're right. I wouldn't take it quite so far as such, but I think maybe that is kind of right. We made choices out of existence, and then we realized we could, instantiate those choices in a structured society. So that was my thought. So
thank you, Phil. Yeah, there's an interesting thing here about anytime you find these core philosophical paradoxes, like are we free or are we unfree? And of course, the answer is both at the same time in a variety of ways. It's the same for all of these things that we fight over: innovation versus standardization, all of these kind of things. So, but we don't like that. We've been taught that the truth is one thing. There's one answer that's right and all the other answers are wrong. And we want to have the right answer. It's true or false, right? And so we keep trying to grossly oversimplify these very intricate, complex webs of dependency that we find ourselves in. I think about the Hollywood addiction to origin stories. They're like, I don't know how to tell the story if it's complicated. I only know how to tell it if we begin at the beginning and there's no past to worry about. Whereas the Greeks in their tragedy said that's just not the human condition. The human condition is we don't even start to ask questions until we have already been around for quite a while, making choices which have been having consequences, which are now binding us up and limiting our freedom. So our current freedom to choose and make decisions is constrained by previous, more benighted choices we already made. This idea that we're in this complicated web of interactions, and that's the context in which we can exercise our freedom, not an infinite plane of choices in every direction we could do whatever we want, but rather this very complicated situation. We don't. That's like rule number one for the Greeks. That's where you begin the discussion. Whereas for most modern adults, they don't ever reach that level of understanding of what it means to make a free choice. We just simply never. We should be teaching that in kindergarten, so that people come out of the gate with an understanding of what freedom is. Instead, we never teach it. And most moderns never actually arrive at that level of understanding of what it means. And it's why you see these political slogans that are so, to call them childlike is an insult to children. They're so pre-childish. They just lack even the most fundamental frame of reference of what human life is actually like. What is our range of choice? What do we owe each other? What is the range of freedom? All of these things.
So don't you think that part of that is because we have lost the ability to appreciate ambiguity?
Yeah,
there needs to be a degree of ambiguity,
yes,
in existence, so that, and you're forced to make choices
Yeah.
that is to a certain degree uncertain, right? I mean, like,
Yeah.
rather than it's like, oh yeah, I already know what it is. So
Yeah.
I think that, and I don't mean to throw so much ambiguity in whatsoever, you're just absolutely confused. But I think you have to develop a degree of tolerance for ambiguity
Yes.
in order not only to free yourself, actually, but in order to let others be freer, because, like, you can't just say, this is the absolute line, you have to draw. So,
yeah. Kenneth Smith talks about this a lot. This is another theme that runs through all his writings. He talks about the way we hold up logic as the highest intellectual good. Be rational, be reasonable, be logical. He says, but that's a child's toy by comparison with the complexities of life. Even a toddler, the choices in a toddler's life are already so complicated. They require far more than logic. He says, the fundamental characteristic of the highest forms of human intelligence, the Vernunft of Hegel, the aristic lifestyle that he appeals to, is taste. He says that, like, on the one hand, you can bring all the logic and reason you want to it, but on the other hand, enormous numbers of things will never resolve to simple binary answers. And you're often going to be left making value judgments and emotional judgments, kind of a sense of the whole and whether this fits better than that can't be justified in any rational, strictly mathematical way. And the Greeks knew that, but we don't. We think it all comes down to numbers and hard truths and, hard-headed, practical, blah, blah, blah. We simply have no tolerance for higher intelligence because of the ambiguity that's involved, necessarily. Joseph, then Stephen, then Donald. Go ahead, Joseph.
Yes, just really briefly. Something that I had actually run into maybe a couple of years ago. Maybe you can help me, and speaks to exactly what we're kind of talking about when somebody was telling me about artificial intelligence and all its capabilities and things along those lines. And we ended up in somewhat of a philosophical discussion at the end of the day. But nice. But one of the things was that I explained it to him is that that artificial intelligence essentially starts with the process to get to an end, where we start with the ends in mind as a human being. And however, that process then naturally evolves from there, that we iterate, and we use our intuition, we use other forms of intelligence to get to an answer. And in that process, there's the discovery and creativity and a lot of other things that kind of come out of that process. And that's kind of one of those distinctions, is that artificial intelligence looks at things in a very mechanistic way, almost in a very hyperlogical way. And it's bounded by the information that you're actually giving it, which it kind of gets to Phil's point a little bit too, is where this idea of you can stomach uncertainty and actually start to embrace it to a certain degree. There's a level of creativity that then comes along with that. Yes. That's innately human. And it's basically the idea of intelligence. When coming back to it, what does it really mean to be intelligent? Necessarily can't be defined by an algorithm or this yes/no approach to this world, like kind of the logic. And here's the thing: you really can't create intelligence if you don't understand it yourself. And so that's where it kind of comes, this idea of dealing with uncertainty, creativity, all the natural processes, the instinctual processes that we have, that are what? They're part of nature. That's essentially what we're saying, is that's our nature that we're trying to recreate. We're trying to recreate, but you won't be able to create it. You'll be able to create something that gives you a yes/no answer using a Bayesian approach to a limited number of rational, the way it understands reality, the data points that it's been given. And so that's where I told him, I said that, some of these things, these instinctual things that we have, is just, it can't be replicated. And we were talking about it in terms of something similar to what you were talking about with Facebook, is that does a human need to be involved with this cybersecurity aspect of things? And that's what we were kind of talking about it in those terms. But it was interesting to just hear the approach that the engineer, where we ended up in a philosophical discussion, is that how does it actually work? How does it actually start to attack the problem to begin with? And this idea that it's starting with a process in mind is a problem to begin with.
That's the right.
That's the problem. It's mechanistic in nature, and not to say that in a closed system that it can't be very powerful, but as we've talked about in something like the game Go, it can be very powerful in those circumstances. But all of a sudden, to think that now that you're going to mimic what human beings do, it's almost gets back to what modernity is. It's like this. There's a yes/no answer here, and there's no ambiguity. Like in between, the law of excluded middle kind of gets thrown out the window.
Right.
And so all of these things, so that ended up to be being the discussion. I just want to make sure to check my logic to make sure it's on point, because that's how I explained it to him, in the sense that if you start with a process in mind to get to an end, then you kind of, it's not that that's not a tool,
right?
But it's a tool. It's not intelligence,
right?
And there's that distinction. And I said, if you start with an end, start with an idea,
yes,
it's a hugely different approach.
Hugely different. Hugely different.
And what's created out of that process is essentially what is the basis of being human in a way. And that's nature.
That's right.
It brings us back, and that's why nature gives us things that we could never even imagine. And this is as true in systems analysis, and as well as with in our daily lives, just the way things organically are created. Anyway, so
yeah.
I've gone on long enough, but I just wanted to make sure my logic was sound.
Yeah.
If that was sound, and if that was a good way of thinking about it in general,
yes.
because I was thinking it from a natural perspective.
Yeah, that's right.
And I was even thinking about it it was right after I'd read a little bit of Kierkegaard, in a way, this idea of rationality is, limited. So
yeah,
that's how kind of I arrived at some of these processes.
It's good. It's a
night
good
of faith in a way. So anyway, all right. So that's all I had to say.
It's good. I mean, and we could do a whole class just about the things that come up with what you just said. It's so full of important ideas. But one thing, I'll say a couple things before I go back to the line of people. One of them is Goethe, right? Always said that nature is the great teacher. And people thought that when he said that, he was being a romantic. Oh, he likes flowers. And literally enormous numbers of moderns, if they read Goethe saying nature is the great teacher, that's their interpretation. Oh, what a sweetie. He's just a sweetheart. Whereas what he's trying to say is the things that nature is able to organize through its approach to organization go far beyond anything people have ever created. We never made a planet and an ecosystem. We never made solar systems and galaxies and super galactic clusters and all these other. We never made anything on those scales, and we can't, because our methods of construction are so constrained by our inadequate understanding of how anything, including ourselves, works. But past civilizations, past epochs knew that about us. Kenneth Smith says, to understand our benightedness, you really have to understand that the great innovation of modernism is that we're the first people that doesn't understand how limited we are, because we buy into the myth of the protean nature of human beings. We think we have no limits. We can't imagine, therefore, that nature has anything important to teach us. We've inverted the whole relationship. Nature's just our toolbox and our larder. That's all we see it as. And anybody who gets emotional about their toolbox or their larder, we look at them like, oh, you're such a child. That's so sweet. But you need to be practical. It has no meaning at all. It's just there for you to use. That's the modern take, right? And we don't understand how that gives us such a disadvantage in trying to be able to do complex things, because we're thinking in such a simple-minded way about nature and the world and our role in it right out of the gate.
And really, just one last thing, the value of uncertainty in that point, like at that point, it comes back to almost like a Gödel's theorem kind of situation where people saw the value in his theorem, but other people were saying, no, there has to be this system, this complete system that we can develop in this process. Well, where other people now are actually, as Donald had talked about a few weeks ago, is that basically created their whole careers around this idea of systems being incomplete. And there's like, what I'm trying to say is, more than anything, is that there's this value in uncertainty and unknowing, that if you allow yourself to just see that, whereas if you start to look at the world in a binary fashion, a very mechanistic fashion, there's no value there as much as it's just a very it's a limited approach. I wouldn't say there's no value. It's limited.
It has limits.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Which so anyway, all right. Well, thank you for allowing me to comment.
And it's the issue with the hammer. If you pick up a hammer and you know that it's only a tool, and that there are many other tools and many other approaches, then you can do a pretty good job of distinguishing what you should be hammering and what you shouldn't. But if you don't have that understanding, if you think that this is a system for understanding everything, you become the proverbial man with the hammer who tries to solve every problem by hammering. And in other words, we have a tendency to assume that all tools are just tools, but it's how we relate to the tool determines whether that's true, or whether the tool begins constraining our intelligence so that we mold ourselves. Instead of the tool being an extension of our body, we start turning ourselves into an extension of the tool. And that's what modernism does when it subscribes to the notion that everything can be systematized and organized. And the great tragedy of this, I guess the Greeks would call it a comedy, but from our perspective, stuck inside of it feels like a tragedy, is that we already tried to make a perfect system of mathematics as the foundation for all things. Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead worked on the Principia Mathematica and tried to establish a completely internally consistent system of mathematics that could become the basis for all thought, all science, all logic, and all life. And they failed. It was huge and cumbersome, and Gödel comes along and deflates the whole thing and explains why it failed. But what happened after that is modernism found that result so intolerable that we've decided to pretend it succeeded, even though it conspicuously failed. And we go on replicating our systems and deifying logic and math as though they're perfect when it's already been proven that they aren't. Because it is so unthinkable to us as moderns, core to our definition, our central Achilles heel, it is so unthinkable to us that we can't systematize everything into perfection, that we've decided to just ignore the evidence to the contrary, even though it couldn't be clearer. It's like, oh my God, we gave it our best shot, we failed, and then we decided not to learn the lesson from that failure. No matter, even though it was one of the great works of Western civilization at its time, and its failure could not have been clearer and more conspicuous, we still decided to pretend that didn't happen because we need it to be true, that it can all be systematized. Stephen, then Donald, then Ginny, then Phil. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, what you brought up has always been my argument, that when I studied a bit of philosophy, and I find this is lacking in all these people that think they're pretty smart, was in culture, in recent modern culture, our ancients, which, you're going back into the Renaissance and all that, understood that in most spheres, we didn't have an absolute idea of the truth.
Right.
But generally, they believe mathematics is the one safe area, that in mathematics, we've found an absolute idea of the truth. And that was going until Gödel came along and screwed it up for them. Now
Right.
there's no safe anchors anymore. But no, yes, that's right. The rationalists can't accept that. They can't accept that the cosmos might have some chaos in it or some irrationality.
Right.
It's this belief in answers. Here's a question, I must have the answer. And if I have to cut the question down the size to fit my answer, that's the way I'm going.
Yes.
But on
Yes.
the question of morals is, for example, I find a lot of rationalists equate morality with good. Now, if I go back 100 or 200 years, they don't say that. They say moral is a force which can either be good or evil. What it's different is to amorality, that you have no fashion of good and evil in you. Hitler believed what he was doing was good. He knew he was going to have to kill a few million to get there, but the end result would be worth it.
Mm-hmm.
And I find this lacking in a lot of modern moral argument. That you look back just in recent history where the church was there, and the church had a more sophisticated moral argument than what's floating around the streets at the moment. What's floating around the streets at the moment is we are moral robots, and there are good robots and there are bad robots.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And even the church was saying, well, you saw it in the Donald Duck cartoon where Donald Duck has the devil duck on his shoulder and the angel duck, that we're making a decision between good and evil, because the church said there is a thing called temptation.
Mm-hmm.
That you can take a person, and if you put them in a narrow set of circumstances, they will be what is good. But what happens when they hit temptation? When suddenly the candy is there to be stolen.
Right.
They're good people until opportunity presents itself. And a lot of what is going on around now is the idea that, again, that we're all good people and there are bad people. Hey, we're the virtuous ones. Look how wonderful I am. Look what a wonderful person I am.
Mm-hmm.
Give me the keys to the city and I'll be good. It seems to be, it's like the Fabian symbol, that we wrap our black hearts in the sheep's cloth of goodness and we fool ourselves. Are we really good people? I don't know about that. I think it's a very, very complex question. It comes down to the question of, say, the pedophile. Do these people actually go out looking for jobs which give them opportunity, or was it simply they found themselves in the world of temptation and succumb to that temptation? And I would say people have become unaware of this, that a lot of people who do bad things simply succumb to temptation. Adolf Hitler, was he such a bad guy? In the Norman Spinrad novel, Adolf Hitler becomes a science fiction writer in America.
Oh my God. Which novel?
The Iron Dream, where he writes this dream novel about a Hitler-type character who rises to power and conquers the world.
Oh God, I'm gonna have to read it.
Well, what if Adolf Hitler instead just had a bohemian lifestyle of selling his paintings? Oh, Hitler! Oh, yeah, I have a glass of wine with him each night. He's a bit arrogant, but he's a very amusing fellow.
Right.
A lot of the people who met Hitler said, "Oh, what a charming fellow." And now we've lost what even the church offered us,
Mm-hmm.
and we're looking upon people as moral robots, that they're automatically bad or automatically good. And the church didn't teach that. The church taught us that we're facing a choice.
Right. Yeah, the medieval conception of good and evil was actually more complex and sophisticated than the modern. We think that we're in advance in every way over the medieval epoch, but in truth, we carry many things forward, but shorn of all their subtlety and nuance. And then we pretend that that makes us more advanced, when actually in many ways, it makes us more incompetent to wrestle with these pivotal questions of life and death. You know, whenever I look at US politics, the full spectrum of it, you know, I always think this is what you get when you don't teach basic principles in philosophy at kindergarten. Like, basic, people need to be taught from the beginning that it's difficult to figure out what's true. And that the one thing you can be sure about whatever you believe is that it is at best a caricature of the truth. And at worst, it might be completely false. It's just going to be really appealing to you. People need to understand the pseudophilia of human beings, the way we're drawn to falsehoods that please us. And that should be taught at the very beginning. And instead, we never teach it. And people go through their whole lives thinking that they have an easy access to true and false and right and wrong.
Well,
which is
it's interesting. Yeah, this is the second time you said that, Rick, and I've been trumpeting that idea of that philosophy for children in starting from kindergarten for years now, and it just made me think, if Putin had philosophy in his grammar school, he would not be making the decisions and doing what he's doing right now. Just wanted to add that to the conversation. Sorry for interrupting.
Okay, Ginny, thanks.
I will add here that, you know, you got the Bible, and a lot of people hate the Bible now. It's the source of all evil for the rationalists. But what do you read in the Old Testament? You read about the good boy David, who's pleasing in the eyes of the Lord, gets power and starts doing some bad things. There's a whole load of characters in the Bible who, facing temptation, go the wrong way. And the Bible's telling people, watch out. Watch out. The temptation can take you somewhere where you don't want to go.
Yeah.
But they'll just throw out the Bible and say, oh, it's all nonsense. You're talking about thousands of years of wisdom, even if you don't agree with it.
They were at least wrestling with questions that we haven't even begun to wrestle with. They're far further along, you know, struggling with these things than we are. I think about Nietzsche's take on this, you know, and he's, when he says power makes stupid, part of what he's saying is there's a subtlety to this, which is things that we identify as the great evils of our leaders, we might not have noticed at all if they didn't have any power. The common foibles of everyday people that don't do a great deal of harm in their everyday lives would become disastrous if they were given access to massive amounts of power. It is exactly the same personality trait. It just got magnified by being given this enormous lever, so that, you know, the discrepancies grow. That is to say, we are taught as moderns, we're taught to be pragmatic, which is that what you need to do is solve your problems, right? We should not worry, not fuss about all this philosophical stuff, and we should just come up with, you know, the most expedient solutions to problems. And what we don't understand is that in the course of that encourages us to ignore the fact that the power to solve our problems is also at the same time the power that will magnify our defects, so that they grow from being amusing quirks to being civilization level disasters. You know, Stephen's comments about the alternative history Hitler as an artist who's just a charming guy and never really hurt anybody, you know, I think we're too quick to dismiss that, because as moderns, we don't want to grapple with the fundamental problems of the way we've organized our world. And so we really want the bad guys to be bad so that we don't have to think too much about why they were bad and what did it mean and what does that mean about us. We would rather that the Third Reich were all monsters. We don't want to hear Hannah Arendt tell us that they're pretty much ordinary people, that Eichmann's predominant characteristic was that he was indistinguishable from any other person. He was just a boring guy who wanted to do a good job. And that what we take for normal and healthy is a disaster in a different context. And it would be the same with Hitler. Put Hitler in a different context without all that power and with a successful art career. And more importantly, looking again at the way that the Western powers created World War II and created the Nazis through the horrific economic sanctions they put on Germany at the end of World War I. What if Germany had a healthy economy? What if people could grow up and have ordinary lives so that they didn't feel this driving need to solve these problems with these extreme measures? When you put people under stress, you see things in them that were always there, but that would never have metastasized to that level. And so there is this way in which we want to demonize the Nazis and other them and say they're the source of evil and the people who fought them are the source of good. But the truth is, we created the Nazis. we did that to Germany. We created that ferment. And it really underscores a recurring theme in Kenneth Smith's work, which is that the relationship between the individual and the culture is far more profound than moderns are willing to understand or accept. And because we are not willing to understand or accept that, we keep creating discultures that cultivate dispersonalities that create problems for all of us. And then we try to pretend that that's just human nature. It's not our fault. We didn't make Jeffrey Dahmer. That was just human nature and people are bad and we just need more police. We go for these simple-minded answers because we don't feel comfortable grappling with the full matrix of the complexities of human nature. Donald, then Ginny, then Phil, then MJ.
Could you just quickly, could you expound on how we created Germany, the condition that they were in to produce Hitler? What do you mean by that?
So Wilson and the other leaders of the Allies against Germany in World War I, when they won World War I, they decided to slap Germany with sanctions designed to make them pay back the total costs of all the damage and all the war efforts that had gone into defeating them. No country could possibly ever do that. So instead, Germany's economy completely collapsed. There are stories of, at its worst, the inflation got so bad that people brought wheelbarrows full of Dutch marks down to the market to buy a loaf of bread. The money was so devalued. So people couldn't survive under these economic relationships. Not only couldn't you get ahead in life, you couldn't pay rent, you couldn't eat, you couldn't get health care. They were completely impossible conditions economically. And it drove people into a panic in Germany. They would do anything to get out of those circumstances. And the huge shame of the whole world doing that to you puts you in a position of, payback, where you are
wondering if this what's happening with Ukraine is going to continue. I'm wondering if something similar could happen to Russia.
Yes. Yes, it could.
Because all the sanctioning going on, that's, with Russia. So you do wonder.
Let me add just a small bit to what Rick said.
Yeah, please.
I think it was not just to pay back the debt that they owe. I think behind it, there was vengeance.
There was vengeance.
There was vengeance, the Furies.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that was the part that was added to it that made us hard. And we learned something from that, because after we won World War II, we did not punish Germany.
Right.
That's actually not true.
Well, that's not true in the sense that we were preparing for the next war, which is the Cold War, and Japan as well. I mean,
the first few years were punishment until suddenly they realized they had a new war on with the Soviets. And then they suddenly realized we'll have to turn around and turn Germany and Japan into forces to make us stronger. I look at those very first few years, and the punishments were there. And suddenly, bang, they suddenly turned on the knife pin when they realized they had a new enemy.
No, they realized they had an enemy from the beginning. I mean, Patton wanted to go on to Russia,
Sure.
Yeah,
well, I've looked at it in detail, and I thought as you did, and I thought as everybody did, that this suddenly this benevolent nature was there from the end of World War II. No, it wasn't. Suddenly the Soviet Union appeared as a new big threat. Oh, we've got to take Germany and Japan under our wings and build them up as the fortresses of democracy.
So we don't have to agree about the timing in order to agree that there was a turnaround, and that what you see, for Ginny's benefit, what you see in the treatment of Germany starting from 47, 48, 49 is very different from the treatment of Germany in 1918, 19, and 20. That after World War I, the enemies of Germany really slapped it with every punishment they could think of. Whereas, after World War II, perhaps after a gap, but at any rate, by the late 40s, the West embraced Germany and tried to help it rebuild. And one of the reasons for that was for the Cold War, but another reason for that was the gradual growing understanding that if we hit them with the same kind of sanctions that we had in 18, 19, and 20, we were just going to create another world war again, because we would again drive them to desperation, and they would again have to do whatever it took to try to rebuild their economy. So we manufactured the German crisis after World War I, and then reaped the terrible benefits. I have a friend who says moderns mistake wars for finish lines, but wars are actually pregnancies, that you are setting something in motion, the full consequences of which you aren't going to understand for decades to come. And you have to be very careful about what you do. So at any rate, I mean, that's kind of the gist, is that there is a lot of culpability in what happened with the Holocaust and the Nazis in World War II that goes far beyond anything Germany did. The whole world was guilty. And, as long as we're on this, just to wrap this up and bring it home, the same was true in World War I. We scapegoated the Germans and said they must pay for all the costs of World War I. But most of the damage of World War I was caused by all of the countries engaging in 19th century military tactics while wielding 20th century weaponry, marching line after line after line of young boys into machine guns, and then being shocked that they just got mowed down, and yet then doing it again because that's what you had been taught in military school, led to massive casualties, which we then blamed on the Germans. But the Germans never told us to march all of our people in a line into their machine guns. We did that. The shock, when you read Paul Valéry and other writers writing between the wars, the great shock is the realization that we called ourselves enlightened and driven by evidence. And yet throughout the entirety of World War I, we failed to learn from our mistakes, even when the mistakes were so big that they resulted in the erasure of an entire generation of young men. It's like, but we couldn't at that point face our own culpability in that slaughter. So we scapegoated Germany because it was an easy answer. That thing where supposedly the most sophisticated, objective, complex, advanced civilization that ever existed, moderns, nevertheless keep choosing childlike, easy answers, like scapegoating, is something that moderns can't explain, but that when you look at existentialist philosophy that critiques modernism, it's easy to understand why moderns keep doing this over and over. We are allergic to nuance and complexity.
Well, don't you excuse yourself when you come home with the gold medal?
Right.
There's nothing else to explore.
At least I'm the winner. Everything's fine.
Right.
Everything's fine. Donald, then Ginny, then Phil, then MJ. Go ahead, Donald.
Well, World War I was just Granny Victoria failing to control her grandkids. And she tried to treat them all fairly, and the British Vickers Company licensed the same machine gun to all the parties involved.
Yes.
Anyway, to go back a long ways, because I'm
I really
slow,
like what you just said.
But
please sit in there for a bit.
about Sartre. Of course, existence is before essence.
Right.
That is, using my mathematical hat here, non-existent beings certainly can't know their own essence. I agree with Sartre. However, I don't think that gets us very far.
No, it's a tautology.
Right. So, of course, one must exist in order to know one's essence. And I think one of the lessons that Kenneth is talking about is knowing one's essence is long, hard work.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not to say that it doesn't develop over simply one's lifetime, but maybe over generations or eons. Mm. And I think we have talked earlier a little bit, such that it was the medievals, like the ancients knew soul, but we have to get to the medievals before human essence says, wait, what's spirit? You know, and it's conceivable that modernity would introduce blindness and self-delusion as a key part of our human essence. I don't know, but it's not to say, even if granted that existence comes before essence, that even if, as I do, arguing that human beings have an essence, right. That's not to say it's intuitive, obviously, just because I am one, that I don't have to work at it. It's, you know, that there's a lot to know, and it may take human history to know all there is about what makes up human beings. Yes. Or if we don't have an essence, this is for Phil, since he's the only one that ever talks about Heidegger, it could be that our essence is simply pondering this question about what's our essence forever, whether we have one or not. Sort of Dasein just goes on, you know, it's always, what is Dasein? It's this creature that worries about what's its own essence. It has this, it's a question for itself in Heideggerian terms, I think. And so even if you don't have one, you have one because trying to obtain that knowledge puts you on a course that could be called your essence.
Yes.
So I think that's enough. One of the things I learned listening to these things is they're so much better when I don't talk.
It's not true, Donald. It's not true. We love your participation.
Definitely not true.
Are you going to pull your I
think Kenneth once said in one of the classes that I clearly remember that a herd of cows is somewhat better organized than humans. You know, they're more in touch with the natural order.
Yeah, that's right.
I think that was just an attempt to get a compliment from us. By berating yourself, you're like, hey, wait a sec, everybody's gonna say that I am important.
Yeah, but I'm happy to compliment Donald. I'm really glad.
Yeah, I'm just kidding.
You know, I may talk a lot on these things and moderate, but Donald has known Kenneth longer than I have by a long shot. He's been listening to Kenneth and reading Kenneth a lot longer than I have. So I always value the things that he has to say.
But perhaps not as closely. I get a great deal out of these.
Oh, good. I'm glad I'm helping.
We all do. We get so much out of this. Thank you so much for sticking with us.
Thank you.
Or leading us, should we say, leading us.
You know, essence, just before I call on Ginny and Phil and MJ, essence and existence. You know, the Greek conception of human character and human nature, I really should just draw a diagram, because it has a structure to it. These words that for us are all blurry sort of synonyms with each other, to the classical Greek philosophers, they had very crisp, precise relationships to each other. So, you know, what is human nature versus what is an individual's nature are related but different questions. You know, the many things that you could become, the range of possibilities, you know, that any Homo sapiens could have is one kind of human nature. But an individual person has their own daimon. That is, they have their own individual character. And as Kenneth likes to say, you could think of human nature in abstracto as the metal and the blank. And it's not that it's empty, but it's the matter. And you could think of the individual character as the face stamped on the coin. The face stamped on the coin that gives it its recognizable qualities and makes it a person. He uses that term all the time. He says the Greek term character is related to the character on the coin in Greek coinage. And that, you know, therefore, an individual is an expression of the possibilities of human nature. But what, as moderns, we are really incompetent to understand, because of this founding myth of Proteus that we can be anything we want to, is that stamped character of ourselves, that is who we are at the moment, becomes our specific nature. That is, the lawfulness in abstracto that applies to all people does not apply to us. We are more tightly constrained than that by our own individual character, because the Greeks believed it is not merely an arbitrary set of choices and affectations about how we want to appear in the world. That character is human nature configured into our nature. And the reason they call it a daimon is that it becomes like a god over us. That is to say, the specific configuration of our personal individual character becomes the laws, like the law of gravity, that determine what choices we can or can't make, what things are thinkable to us or unthinkable to us, what insights are we ready for or not ready for. I mean, the whole host of possible choices of where we go from here is determined by that individual nature that has grown up out of the sort of more generic possibilities of human nature we were born with. And so there is a double relationship. When we talk about all the things that human nature could allow, it doesn't necessarily apply to us. So we're not governed by abstract human nature. We're governed by our specific nature, our character. And it's the thing that rides us on our back and nudges us this way and that, and makes some things seem reasonable and other things seem unreasonable. And that's why the Greeks said, the only way that you can, the feeling that you are free and that you're seeing the world the way it really is so instinctive and natural to human beings that you really need a relentless reminder that it's not true. That you are not every man. You are your specific person, and there are certain things you can and can't do, certain things you can and can't see. And that's why they had the whole myth of the daimon. They said, if you think, you know, you do okay keeping in mind Zeus and Ares and Athena. So let's leverage that and say, in addition to the 12 deities and all the others in the pantheon, there is a 13th deity for you, and that is your daimon that rules you just as relentlessly as these others rule you. And you need to be as aware of it as you are of the others, so that it can help to guide you to understand your range of freedom, your range of choice, your range of good and evil and all of that. This conception of the relationship between human nature and individual nature that they are both as binding upon us as the law of gravity or electromagnetism or anything else, is something that as moderns we don't have, because we're allergic to the idea that we're so constrained. We don't want to think that not only are human beings constrained in abstracto, but we as individuals are deeply, profoundly constrained by our own character. This is just like the skin crawls. As a modern, the more you dig into that, the less you like it. It's just, but what about freedom? It's like, you know, if you want to understand freedom, you first have to understand your constraints, right? Harriet Tubman was such an expert on freedom because she knew she started out as a slave. She knew what she needed to do. She understood her constraints in the direction she needed to go. And the ones who didn't understand their condition as slaves were not as prepared as she was to make the journey north and then to rescue other people. It's the same for us. If we want to be free, we have to understand the structure and nature of our constraints. So character, essence, these are the things, you know, anytime we talk about these, anytime these key terms come up, essence and character and so on, I always want to double check and make sure that we aren't applying modern interpretations of these words, because the modern interpretations turn them inside out and it all becomes a pudding of vague feelings and impressions. Whereas the Greeks and Kenneth Smith mean something very crisp and very precise and very important.
Very well said, Rick, and right on point.
Thank you, Donald. Ginny, then Phil, then MJ. Go ahead, Ginny.
Yeah, I have a question. How do we go about creating dictator philosophers? See, dictators are very good at making everybody do what he or she wants people to do. So how do we create a dictator who's a philosopher so that that dictator will say it's mandatory that all children have exposure to philosophy and think like a philosopher? How about that?
Well, if there is some context in which Plato's philosopher king idea could work, it isn't a modern one. It isn't a modern one because he means Aristoi. When he says philosopher kings, he's talking about Aristoi. And to be an Aristos, you have to have been raised in an aristic culture. Aristeia is not something anybody can achieve by themselves. You certainly can't achieve it if everything in your culture and civilization around you is militating against it. Every person who in the modern world contains aristic seeds is a deformed Aristos, because we are shoved into one of the two roles that's allowed under modernism. We are either living our lives like Duloi or living our lives like Banausoi, and we are warped and suffering intense mental illness from the misfit of being pounded into these round holes when we're not round pegs. So think again about Nietzsche's warning, power makes stupid. What happens if you take a deformed person, a deeply sick person, even if in some other context they could have been healthy? But what happens if you take a sick person and you give them power? Well, as with Stephen's example of Hitler, which I think is really apt, right? You could be a charming, wonderful person in some other context, but when you're handed power, it's not just your virtues that are magnified, it's your vices. All Aristoi in the modern world are deeply broken. So if you give them power, that brokenness will be magnified and all kinds of terrible things will be unleashed upon the world. Certainly you don't want a doulos or a Banausos to be king or tyrant over people because their defects are manifest. But you also don't want a modern Aristos to be raised up there because they're by definition a broken person. I think it's safe to say for the foreseeable future, we should just dispense with philosopher kings. We have nobody competent, and we're not even competent to produce somebody competent. We should be focusing on forms of governance that allow us to minimize the damage that can be done by the vices of the people, and that find ways to reinforce the virtues of people working together. And if we do that, we might be able to make a healthy enough culture that generations from now, someday they could produce somebody who could do something like that. Now, I'm not saying that even under those conditions, I think there ought to be a philosopher king who's in charge. I'm just saying the case against a philosopher king under the current circumstances is so clear. The philosophers on this couldn't be clearer and sharper. It's just too dangerous. It's just too dangerous.
Since I had the floor so briefly, can I just? Yeah. I have to say, I'm sorry to cut you off, Rick, but I was shocked. I've been just listening to the news about Ukraine all morning, and one of the things they said of what's happening is that some of these Russian soldiers, they thought they were going out to do an exercise drill. Yes. Not realizing that they were actually getting into a war. And and so, I mean, when I think of Putin, this demonic person, anyway, don't let me just keep going. All right, let me shut up. All right.
Well, one of the interesting things that's been happening in the last week or two is defections and refusals by Russian soldiers who are like, this is not what I signed up for. Ukraine and Russia were long closely related. People have a lot of relatives. They're like, we are not interested in going and beating up our relatives.
There's some defections going on?
Oh, yeah. There's a lot of refusal going on. And Russia's trying not to talk about it too much openly. They're trying to suppress it. But the truth is, these would-be dictators today who dream of the empires of the past don't understand that we're not in the past. And that people's ideas about right and wrong and about how nations should relate to each other, they may not be enlightened today, but they're certainly in a different place than they were in the time of Alexander the Great or Napoleon or whoever these people's heroes are. And so taking the full circle, the reason why AI is such a dream in the modern world is that modernism, being a system of mechanical predictability, is frustrated by the unpredictability of human beings. And human police officers, human soldiers, human workers, they keep not doing what you order them to do. They'll do it sometimes and not others, or they'll do it to start with and then later they'll change their minds. And it's deeply frustrating to the modern order that it's trying to use, this is the man with the hammer problem. It's trying to use systematic logical organization on organisms that are not fundamentally systematic and logical. And so the solution, as with the man with the hammer, is not to say, gee, I wonder if I've been possessed by my tools and come to misunderstand the world, and I'm fantasizing of a machine order that could never actually work. Maybe I should change my approaches to governance. No, they don't do that because that's the core thing of modernism. That's the water they swim in. They can't question it. So what they do instead is say, what if I could get other soldiers or other policemen or other workers that were systematic and would do exactly what I told them to? I could exploit them to my heart's content and they would carry out my every whim. And then I could bring about the paradise on earth that I just know I can do if I can get 100% control over everything through my systems of logic and organization. So this is why they desperately, desperately want AI. They want a future of robots and AI because then they can, force everybody to live according to the laws by having robots beat the shit out of us every time we jaywalk. I mean,
that's Gort.
Say that again.
That's Gort out of what was that film again with Michael Rennie in it?
Yeah.
The Day the Earth Stood Still, Stephen.
Yeah, that was Gort's job. He was the master. Right. Farewell to the master.
Right. The dream of the perfect obedience to a systemic order. Yeah, that's right. So anyway, that's the thing that keeps happening, especially with modern wars, is more and more we get these problems where people keep not being as predictable as our systems of organization insist they ought to be. And we keep trying to solve it not by learning and doing better, but by trying to replace the people with something more predictable like a robot. And of course, what we would discover if we were able to do that is that we would be incompetent to order the robots properly, because even those giving the orders are not as systematic as they fantasize that they are. The incoherencies of those who seek to govern us systematically would be the undoing. But we'll see what happens. Phil, then MJ, then Stephen. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I'm going to transition into my point by sort of briefly addressing Jenny's question.
Yeah.
You know, when I was still teaching, often the topic would come up, you know, about one's position in society. And I told them that if I was them, and I believe this, I lived it out in my life.
Yeah.
The society being what it is, there's always so much, you know, finagling of the system that one could be ranked, placed 3 ranks above or 3 ranks below, and or what's natural to one's rank. And I said, you know, like, of course, one would be nice to be placed in the right rank that you belong. But if you had to, I would rather be underranked than overranked, right? So imagine if you were a major in the Army. Not that that's a perfect system, but let's pretend it is. 3 ranks above would be lieutenant colonel, colonel, and general. 3 ranks below would be captain, lieutenant, maybe master sergeant. And so here you go, like the same people with the same ability. One is a general, one is a master sergeant. Okay. Of course, your pay would be different, and the kind of external respect you would get, you're a general, yes, sir, that kind of thing.
Right.
But the problem is that you're overranked and you don't know what the hell you're doing. And pretty soon people know that you don't know what the hell you're doing.
Right.
So you're going to spend your time doing 2 things. One is when they disobey, you throw them in the brig.
Right.
Exercise your power. The other one is you spend most of your day hiding in the closet.
Yes. Trying not to make decisions.
Anybody to ask you any question. But if you were just a mere sergeant, somebody asked you a question, oh, yes, I know that. And in the rare case you ask a question that you can't answer, you said, oh, that's way above my pay grade.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So you have an out. I think that would apply. I would never want to be the philosopher king in the contemporary position. Perhaps as an advisor whispering in the philosopher king's ear. That I might accept, but certainly not the philosopher king. So now I'm going to transition to what I say about the thing about philosophy in general.
Yeah, shoot.
Being, I wonder whether philosophy itself is not, in some sense, if not originally, at least at some point, degenerated through metaphysics in the system of rules that was really about the will to power, right? The control of the system itself.
Yes.
To the point that at some point, the forms are supposed to give the forms to, in a sense, to understand the diverse information that's coming in, the content, to give meaning to content, coherence to content. But at some point, the form became so powerful that eventually it became not only the form, but the content itself.
Yeah.
So it had total control. So I think that's the problem when you're faced with modernity, is how do you get away from that? And I mentioned Barbara Kruger as an artist before, you know, that did the very famous, a very simple thing, you know, anybody could have done it if they had thought of it. You know, there was a hand holding up a car says, I shop, therefore I am. And if you were naive, you would say, oh, yeah, that's right. Because, you know, like when I'm feeling blue, I go shopping and suddenly I feel like, yes. Oh, okay, everything seemed fine.
Yes.
So that's okay. Until you realize that, well, wait a minute. Maybe I'm feeling fine because I've been taking this psychotic drug that make me feel fine, right? And now you're trying to say, well, yeah, but I have to take it because otherwise I just feel lousy. I'm feeling blue.
Yes.
So then you have the choice between, yeah, I should take it. No, I shouldn't. Then you're left in the state. I think that's what modernity is. You left in the
Yes.
state of irony, right?
Yes. Yes.
The self-reflection, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. And once you understand that, you can understand what her statement truly is about. It's not like reinforcement of shopping, but it's really taking down, first of all, I think, therefore I am, the form.
Yes. Yes.
And then Adam Smith, the content. I go shopping, all the stuff. You're like, wow, I feel good. Now I got both the form and the content, and you're sitting there and you're looking at it. This is a very ironic situation. And the only way you could even get out of it is to understand that, oh, I'm caught in a bubble, a double bubble,
Yes.
the double bubble gum that I can't escape.
Yes.
Either the form or the content. All I could think about it is like waiting for Godot.
Yeah.
Sit there waiting, wondering, and no wonder we're in this sort of psychic state. Like, what the hell do we do? Right? It's like, because unless you just like, don't even remember that, just keep on taking the drug. Just take the drug. That's you feel good. I think that's what her work of art is trying to do, is to show you the irony,
yes,
the state of irony that you exist in, that you at least are realizing that you are living in a state of irony. All you could do is comment about being trapped in the irony itself.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
That's where the will, the will to power has left us.
Rick, could I just ask David a very quick question, David Roel? I just got a message that says today's meeting was canceled. I'm just wondering, just curious as to know what must have happened. I'm just curious. Did anybody else get a message that this meeting was canceled?
No, I didn't. But usually what happened is like he puts a link to it late, quite often, so that if you come in early, it's like, what, I can't seem to get on it.
I think they're referring to the other meeting, the whatchamacallit. There was supposed to be a lecture today about the trajectory of time, how time flows. And that one was canceled because
I know, but that was TPM. But this is specifically this meeting right now that's happening. I just got a message said that this meeting was canceled. I was just wondering if something to do with the meeting.
We're all here, so
no, we're not here. We're in a state of non-being.
Yes, exactly. We don't exist.
The thing is, I got the message like 3 minutes ago, as opposed to an hour ago. I just got it. I'm just wondering, is somebody playing with my computer? Anyway,
somebody's playing with David's
computer.
It's
the AI helping you.
Helping me.
Facebook's AI is helping.
Yeah, I'm getting extra help. I should be feeling privileged. Is that right? Okay.
Exactly.
That's right. Artificial intelligence. Sometime we could have a talk about artificial intelligence. I have a good friend who follows this field very closely, and he and I talk about it a lot. So, anybody who wants to get beyond the sort of generic descriptions of AI that you see in the media and understand kind of what the state of the art is, it's not that hard to explain. I could bring people up to date, but I just don't want to do it today, or it would eat the whole rest of the session.
Well, I don't know if you know this. I used to go to this group philosophy meeting. I call them the San Francisco group. And there was this, one of the regulars, in fact, he was one of the co-hosts. I just forgot his name, darn it. Anyway, he also, I think, goes to philosophers and drunkards or something like that, that meet somewhere. But he actually is doing AI. I mean, he's actually creating AI software and all that. So, yeah.
I was hoping, Rick, that we could have a session on, or get some thoughts about from Kenneth's philosophy on how AI and all these forms of media is affecting the next generation.
Oh, sure.
Well, let's go a couple of generations down and see. or just, I'm sorry, Phil, Rick, sorry.
So Jyoti, David is, I don't know if you know, but David is collecting questions for Kenneth Smith. Kenneth has said he's willing to join us for one of these and do a seminar, and he would love to tailor it to our questions. And that question that you just asked, I think that really ought to be one of them, right?
Yeah, because, you know, it's the next generation, and it's what we pass on to the next generation too. Yeah, at least consciously, we know what we're passing on. Would be really helpful to parents at different stages too. And I would love to learn more about that. So who do I send the message to? David?
Well, you could just,
or do I just comment on this?
Okay. And we'll capture it and pass it on to Kenneth, and he can prepare for it as part of the seminar he gives.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much. Oh, and I had also a quick question, Rick. So I was doing a research. I was just doing a Google search. So AI was helping me out. And something showed, it was for poems, but what showed up was Kenneth Smith in the White House or something like that. Do you know what that's about?
That's a different Kenneth Smith.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. If you Google Kenneth Smith, there are 3 or 4 of them that come up a lot. And only one of them is our guy.
Oh, okay. Because I was like, what's going on here?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much, Rick.
Sure. Yeah. If you try to Google photos of Kenneth Smith, you get one, and every other photo is other guys. And the one you get is the black and white one that David sometimes puts associated with these, on the website and elsewhere. He doesn't particularly like to share photos. But
that's good to know. There's more than one guru out there.
I think one of the others is a motorcycle enthusiast, part of a bike club, and I forget which third one.
Yeah, you have to know which guru you're following. No, I mean that very, tongue in cheek.
Yeah.
Nothing.
Yeah, I understand.
Okay.
So Phil's core point about moderns living in a state of irony, I think the other point that you had there was about not getting the joke, right? The whole, I shop, therefore I am, and people are going, oh yeah, that sounds reasonable. It's like, oh, sweet Jesus. There's a couple of parts to this. I'm going to do the easy one now so I can call on MJ and Stephen, and I'm going to save the harder one for after them. But the easy one is, I must say this every time we do one of these seminars. This is why Kenneth Smith struggles with vocabulary and tells us that we need to struggle with vocabulary. Because if we don't understand the terms and we don't understand the philosophical conversation that has come before, then we don't know how to decipher what he's saying. And we could read it not just as different from what he's trying to say, but as the exact opposite. We could think he's promoting things that he's actually against. The last time he gave a big public seminar, one of the people accused him of being a eugenicist and pro-fascism, which couldn't be further from the truth. It's more or less the opposite of the truth, but it shows the extent to which, if you don't know what people mean by their terms, you could take them as anything. You could think I shop, therefore I am is meant as a sincere statement of, this is the good and the true. And I remember when I was first reading Kenneth's columns in the Comics Journal, he modulates in and out of irony frequently. He frequently makes ironic statements. And even when he's not doing that, as a culture critic, he frequently makes negative statements about what we do. But with a, I can't say pre-philosophical, but let's say with a naive philosophical perspective, like I had, 20 some odd years ago, I didn't know how to take it when he wrote those things. I didn't know if he was saying those are good things or bad things. That exact, what you're describing, Phil, that exact experience was the experience I had when I was first reading Kenneth Smith. I'd be like, is he praising us or criticizing us when he says that? And that's because I just lacked the context. I'm put in mind of one of my 10 favorite episodes of Star Trek: The Next Generation, Darmok, which is when the crew of the Enterprise meets a culture that speaks entirely in fragments of stories. Darmok and Jalad at Tanagra, says the captain of the alien vessel. And everyone's looking at each other going, is the translator working? And they're all going, yeah, that's what he said. He said Dharmak Angelad at Tanagra. And everyone's going, I just have no idea what any of that's about. And the whole way through it, it takes you the whole episode to figure out that it's a culture that has a shared context. And rather than spell everything out, they tell you moments from stories that they think you know. And if you know the story, you not only get some facts, but you get a whole context of meaning and what came before and what could come after and what people are striving for. It's this rich communication system, but it only works if you share the context. And I think that that's the problem with people coming to Kenneth Smith and trying to read his work, is that there's such a rich context that it can take a very long time to start to figure out what he means by these words and what he means. Is he criticizing or not criticizing, or what's going on? I shopped, therefore I am. That's going to stick with me, Phil. Thank you. That's a classic example of the dangers of trying to communicate. I would also point out, and I hate doing this, because on the one hand, I'm saying, yeah, I think people should be more philosophically sophisticated. We should start teaching them in kindergarten. But on the other hand, it does have to be stated that Nietzsche correctly warned us that philosophy is only for the healthy, he says. The sick it has ever made sicker. And the way I reconcile these two is that I think as we acculturate into modern society, we grow sicker. There are many adorable little kids who grow up into angry, bitter adults, you know, who are ruled by ideologies, but they weren't when they were 4 or 8. And so it may well be that kindergarten is exactly the right level at which to teach philosophy, because they're not as sick as they will become later. Later, they can incorporate the philosophy into defenses of their ideologies that they've been indoctrinated into. But early on, before the ideologies have them, it can help them blossom their creative thinking and to, you know, engage with the world in a freer, more open way that maybe would help to inoculate them against
Absolutely.
ideology.
I agree.
Maybe. I'm just giving this as a caveat. You know, when I say that we should teach it earlier, I want to make sure that I'm laying out the downsides and, you know, the thinking as well.
No, I totally am with you on this. I really do. Yeah.
Totally with the idea.
We may prevent serial killers from blossoming, you know, and all kinds of things. If it's taught and conducted and given a right kind of environment and directed in a right sort of way. Like you would be a perfect professor for kindergartners. Introduction, but really, truly, I mean, I think it could be done well, and it would be very beneficial to children, very.
I might butt in here, I'm sorry, but we've already discussed these moral questions. Kenneth Smith has already pointed out they had these moral discussions at the end of the Roman Empire and decided man is corrupt and we must put God above man.
Right.
Now you've gotten rid of God and you're going back to, maybe man is good. We'll try and create good robots out of people. You're just going full circle and you don't even notice.
Modern education in a nutshell, right? We'll just make nice consumers out of everybody. You'll all produce. Yeah, I mean, there's real hazards here. You're right. MJ and then Stephen. Go ahead, MJ.
Two things. The first is patterns. And as we keep talking, I keep seeing this pattern of humans. And I'm willing to go out on a limb and say that at any time, any place, you're going to have 80% of a population that just wants the right answer. Give it to them, they're not going to exert any effort. And then 20% who know they're going to have to figure it out for themselves. And so they just get on with it. So I figure 80-20, I'm safe, Pareto optimum. And I think of the 80-20s who just want the right answer as what is. This is what I want to understand. Tell me what it is. And the others are the what if people. But here's the problem. As moderns, we're putting additional pressure on ourselves that makes the 80%, the what ifs people, even worse at the way they get their answers and conduct themselves, because the problem is the pressure of time perception. There's how time is perceived cannot possibly have been the same in 2400 BC as it is today, any nature. So, okay. So once we're in this, we're getting, our rate of increase is speeding up. Not just we're increasing, but our rate of increase is speeding with this digital life. And as we have these myths like time slicing and multitasking, it gets us to worship the efficiency, the effectiveness of time use. And we get tinier and tinier and less critical. And it's just more pressure on us to be the inefficient 80%. So that was the irony. The other part I just wanted to mention is, I think we probably all were in high school and knew our GPAs to the 6th decimal point. And we used to laugh that, thinking is hard. And I regret to say that you could say thinking is hard. And, people say, don't worry, we got the AI for it. So, that's it. Those are my 2 points, patterns and irony. Yeah. I like your phrasing of what is people versus what if people. That's interesting. I haven't heard that before. It rolls off the tongue nicely. And you're right. There's a huge amount of irony to this. Jesus. When I talked about the dangers of seeking philosopher kings out of moderns, that even anybody with the potential to become an Aristos ends up deranged. And part of the way that proto-Aristoi end up being deranged is exactly what you said. The clock, tick, 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 go, 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 go. If you don't make enough money to earn a living, that is to earn the right not to die, which is the premise of modernism, that you don't deserve to live. But if you work hard enough, maybe we'll allow it temporarily. That pressure shifts us into our limbic system. I from time to time, I mention Robert Axelrod, and he's got a number of books. The Evolution of Cooperation is one of them, where he talks about, based on his studies of game theory, putting people into running different experiments on when do people cooperate and when do they not cooperate. He says he comes up with kind of ingredients that are necessary in the culture for people to cooperate. And it's really clear when you look at this, although he doesn't follow all the way through. When you look at what he's describing, you can see how the go, go, go culture of the modern world is designed to eliminate cooperation. Even if nobody meant it to be designed that way, it couldn't be better designed. It's optimized to kill the cooperative impulses within us, because people are always rocked back on their heels into their limbic system, worried about their basic survival. We all know if you lose your home, if you can't get health care, you will die. You might not die immediately, but you'll die measurably younger at an earlier age than people who have health care, who have a home. And that it's your access to money, which for most of us comes from working our asses off, that basically allows you to survive. We're basically shoved into survival mode pretty early on, and we're kept there. And if you study Robert Axelrod's theories about cooperation, what you can see is that people in that mental framework cannot be their best selves. They can't. They become more selfish. They become more anxious and stressed. The stress causes disease. They get earlier heart attacks. They get strokes. They get depression. You look at our society and how many people have to be on significant antidepressants just to function at all.
not to achieve their best life, not to live a life of joy, but just to get up and go to work. They have to be drugged because we never evolved to be under relentless stress, right? Adrenaline and other hormones like that, the whole hormonal signaling system of the body is made up of chemicals that the body is not usually exposed to. The ones it's usually exposed to are the ones we made the structure out of.
Well,
right?
I was struck by the number of people at work using ice as an upper. Using methamphetamines as an upper, the amount of people who are secretly doing that.
Yes. Yeah, there are whole towns in Eastern Washington where it is an open secret that there's just an epidemic of meth use. And it's not among the undesirables, it's among the working poor. That's how they get themselves to go back to work, to the conditions that they're in.
But they're just the deplorables, they don't matter.
Right, exactly, right. That's we just shove those problems aside. Either or, right? The law of the excluded middle. So, what I'm getting at here is what you're talking about, MJ, with this TikTok culture, go, keep people under stress. It destroys the capacity for any higher culture. I mean, a recurring theme you're going to see in this book by Kenneth is that it is the aristoi within a culture who are the ones who can escape the two traps of, the dualic mode of being or the banausic mode of being. And therefore, they're the ones who can question the core premises of a civilization, diagnose what's otherwise going to kill it, and come up with ways to help the civilization change course to survive and be healthier. They play an essential metabolic role in the lifespan of a culture. And if they are suppressed, whether because of a tick-tock clock and anxiety, or in order to keep them from interfering with vested interests, with conflicts of interest, right? Because change disrupts vested interests. Or for whatever other reason, what you end up with is a culture that can't survive as long because it has removed the creative source of culture building, the people who are able to think outside the two boxes. And it's a culture doomed to obsolescence. You will often read, including in this very chapter we're reading now, you'll often read Kenneth using terminology that makes it clear that he says modernity's days are numbered, but he's not doing it like an old time preacher on the corner saying, the end is nigh. It's not that kind of thing. What he's saying is, if you saw a human being who had sabotaged his own immune system for momentary advantage, you'd say there's a human being who isn't going to be around very long. It's not an article of faith. They're just damaging part of what keeps them going. And nobody keeps going without that part. So this is it. He's anatomizing how cultures work, how they survive, and he's anatomizing modernity and what it has done in the interest of pragmatism. And he's saying that we're basically sabotaging our future in order to maximize our present by suppressing the development of aristoi. Aristoi are extremely annoying and obnoxious. They can be charismatic and they can be fun and all that other stuff, but they're going to question things that you don't want to have questioned. And that's their job. And a culture that doesn't allow that to happen is a culture that doesn't have a future. Because without that, it means that you're trapped by the core premises of your culture. The culture can't grow beyond them, and eventually it'll collapse. Stephen and then Phil. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, I was going to say that this process in the press we're seeing of demonising Putin is just stupid. This vision we have of ourselves as Westerners, that we're the enlightened ones.
Right.
We're God's good children, and the other side are the black and evil demons.
Right.
It's just been portrayed through the press, and I'm struggling to find what's going on.
Yes.
That all these people are telling bad stories, that you're trying to find the few good insights. This is one of the troubles with the modern media, that like if you say you've got a problem with your computer online, you'll have about 100 people that say, sorry, I can't help you.
Right.
I'm sorry, I wish I could help you. So why don't you just shut up and let somebody actually knows what they're talking about? get online. And this seems to be a lot of the press about this current situation. Like, it's very hard to find any discussion of what are Putin's real motives, what are his concerns, why is he doing what is he actually doing? They keep on saying he's trying to completely overrun the Ukraine with a force backing of about 200,000 soldiers, which just doesn't seem likely. And what I've seen in the past, look, about 15, 20 years ago, I was doing a lot of analysis, and I could see in America, it was beyond my understanding, but I could predict that sometime between 2020 and 2030, that the Western culture of America was going to split into two competing halves that will not like each other, will become violent and try to kill each other.
Yeah.
And my 2005 imagination couldn't conceive of this. How is this possible? But I have the examples in history.
That's right.
One of my clues was, when I was studying finance, was a guy was saying, you know, the Republicans and the Democrats, years ago, they used to argue with each other, then go and have a beer. Now they won't talk to each other. They don't want to know each other. And that was my clue that so many years down the track that this was going to happen. Yeah. Now, another thing I could foresee looking at history is the West, like this present conflict with Russia, is the one which in the few next decades, the West is going to make gains in Eastern Europe and get more and more in Russia's backyard. But they cannot grasp that Putin, Russia are all examples that there is a different spirit from what we conceive of in the West. And we discount that spirit. We discount Putin as being relevant.
Right.
And what I could foresee in history is, yeah, there will be little conflicts, we'll make some little gains, we'll get up to Russia's closer and closer to Moscow. And then one day they'll think, oh, they will just discount these Russians. As Hitler said, just kick in the front door and the whole rotten thing will come down. And I could foresee Napoleon, Hitler is going to be repeated by the new West. They'll go for the jugular. They'll think, gee, all we have to do is eliminate the Russians and we've eliminated all our problems on that cultural front.
That's what we think.
But what most likely will happen, as in the past, the West will get its ass kicked. It'll get its ass kicked so bad that psychologically, no matter what progress the West makes after that point, they'll never recover.
Yeah.
And it will be part of the downfall of the West. They don't understand it. The West might win the present conflict, but they'll keep on moving up till they strike something that will not lose. But the West has this vast imagination of how good we are and how wonderful we are and how nicely we dance.
Yes.
They just do not understand there is something different from what you understand there. They won't understand.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, there is, the human ego is a dangerous thing. It is, many philosophers have said it is the most dangerous thing. I cite Heraclitus about every other time when he says, even if your house is on fire, it's more important to quench your ego than to quench the fire in your house, because there's no disaster that you can't make worse through the exercise of your ego. Even your house on fire could be made so much worse by going at the problem egotistically, which is our natural inclination because we're so addicted to our own ego. This is the horror films of George Romero, Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, all of his cycles. Every one of those films is about that same core message. There is no disaster that can't be made worse by the ego of human beings squabbling amongst each other, turning on each other, stabbing each other in the back. And you can see that writ large when you look at how could Hitler, who was crazy about military history, loved his military history, could look at the example of Napoleon getting his ass kicked in Russia and say, you know what I should do? I should invade Russia. And I should do it in winter like Napoleon did because I'm better than Napoleon. I couldn't possibly make the same mistake by doing exactly the same thing. That the irresistibility of treating life as a test, and especially when you think in zero-sum games, the law of the excluded middle, when you think, how do I know I'm great unless I'm better than so-and-so? If he failed, I have to do exactly the same thing and succeed to prove that I'm better. So in goes Hitler, right on the tail, right, of Napoleon. Beautifully documented example about why it's a hideously stupid idea, and he does it anyway. I suspect there is more than a 50% chance that Stephen is right, that sooner or later, the United States will go, well, that was just Hitler, and everybody knows he was a crazy guy. But we have the biggest military in the world. We have the most nukes. We're the most scientific advanced civilization that ever existed. We need to bring freedom to everybody, including Russia. So sooner or later, it's like Chekhov's gun on the table. The American ego won't be able to resist invading Russia during winter, just to prove that we could do what they failed at in order to establish how much better we are than they are. And you know when people are the most likely to make blunders like that is when they're failing in other parts of their lives and they need a distraction. We're going bankrupt from overspending on our military, but we don't want to think about that because there's so much money at stake in that bankruptcy, in people continuing, in the government continuing to buy more than it can afford in terms of in military and weapons, that we need an enemy that could make us think it was all worthwhile. I read an analysis that said, you know, aside from the other differences that we cherish and love to talk about in the United States between the Democrats and the Republicans in this huge culture fight and tug of war, says when it comes down to the large scale history of the country going forward from here, that the big difference between the Democrats and Republicans are whether the next world war should be against Russia or against China. Each party hates one of them more than the other one. And each party accuses the other party of cozying up to the one that it hates, right? What unites them, we talk about our differences relentlessly, but what unites them is, you know, when it comes time to vote for massive increases in military spending, despite the Cold War having been over for decades at this point, both parties agree, and almost all legislators from both parties vote for massive military increases of spending, even while we're going bankrupt. It's not that there's no differences, but it's that they are united by a common vision of the Pax Americana, right? They're united by the idea that they can't seem to get agreement or traction on all the difficult, serious problems we face, but they can get traction on let's go kick somebody's butt.
Surely American military spending is dwarfed by welfare and healthcare.
Only if you include the non-discretionary spending. The way the budget is structured, things like Social Security are non-discretionary. If you look at discretionary spending, the amount that Congress actually has control over, the US military budget is larger than the domestic budget. So it all depends on how you add the numbers up. But at any rate, regardless of exactly where the numbers come down, I think every country would agree we're spending way more than we can. Everybody can see the US going down.
Yeah, I'd like to see some of those numbers. Just
We're
the simple post-10 numbers.
Yeah.
We spend more than the next 10 countries combined
On our military.
On our military.
Yeah, it's terrifying. So regardless of the exact proportion, when it comes to what is the actual threat that the United States faces in the world today militarily, most of the threats we face are threats that we manufactured by saber rattling. You know, there's a reason why, you know, one of the things we don't want to talk about Putin is that we made a promise to Russia, a binding promise that we would not try to suck up all of the Eastern European countries that used to be part of the Soviet alliance into NATO. We promised we wouldn't do that. But what have we done? We're sucking them all up into NATO. We're doing exactly what we said we wouldn't do. So as far as Putin's concerned, you can't trust US treaties or promises as far as you can throw us. He has very good reason to be stressed. And we have very good reason to stress him because we don't want to deal with our budget deficits, our crumbling infrastructure, our sick healthcare systems, which is one of the worst in the world. I mean, we have major serious problems that we do not want to think about. But you know what helps to get people's minds off of that? Oh God, here come the Russians. Let's have a war. Even the Romans are well documented as saying, when you're in trouble, reorganize the government and pick an enemy and fight a war. It's been known for thousands of years what a cheap political ploy this is, but we still fall for it every time. And then our this goes back to how did we treat Germany after World War I, right? What do we do once we manufacture a crisis like the Ukraine? We pretend that we are as pure as the driven snow and had nothing to do with it. And who can imagine why this crazy person did this thing he did? But evil must be fought, and so we need to stand up against that guy. It was the same with the Japanese bombing Pearl Harbor. We knew they were going to attack us because we knew they desperately needed natural resources because they're a tiny island nation. And we were hemming them in for year after year, taking away their access to rubber, to iron, to all the things that they needed. We knew they were going to attack us. That was why we did that. I mean, it's like, but the official propaganda when it's time to actually do the war is, we were pure as the driven snow. We were innocent children who just believe in human rights and freedom. And who could have imagined that this crazy person would do this crazy thing? But gosh, now that they forced us into it, I guess we'll have to raise military spending and go fight a war. Every time we do this, Jesus Christ, and we never learn from it. Phil and then Joseph. Go ahead, Phil.
Well, I always thought that we made a big mistake after the fall of the Berlin Wall, that we should have been, maybe we didn't have to be friendly, but we should have, created some relationship that's more intimate with Russia.
Yeah.
Now, maybe, what was his name? The guy that preceded. Well, anyway, maybe he was a bit of a buffoon, but he was a decent guy. He was a decent guy.
Yeltsin or Gorbachev?
Yeltsin, yeah, Yeltsin. Well, Gorbachev, was actually quite liberal in his way of thinking.
Yeah.
And so, but he was out, so we couldn't really deal with him.
Yeah, we got.
But Yeltsin was, I think Yeltsin was a decent guy. He was maybe a little buffoonery, but nonetheless, I think we could have treated him nicer, and then we could have
love alcoholics.
I know, yeah, well, yeah, that's what I mean. It's like, but on the other hand, I think if we had treated them better, they might have been, integrated into a much more friendly sort of relationship with not only us but with the world, right? I thought that was a big mistake.
Oh no, it was on purpose.
Yeah.
What you're describing, you're describing one of the most important moments in Russian-U.S. relationships, and you got it right. If we had done that, the course of history would have run differently.
That's I think the reason we didn't do that is because we just had this tremendous memory of the recent past, and it was hard for us to forgive them or something.
Oh no, that's not it.
That wasn't it. Well, whatever the reason is, I thought it was a big mistake.
We were in a panic. We didn't count on the Berlin Wall falling. We didn't count on the Soviet Union collapsing. The only justification for the massive military we had was that we were in a struggle to the death against evil. And when evil suddenly turned out to be a squib, when they fell apart, the question was raised, well, now that we don't have a Cold War anymore, shouldn't we downsize our military and start investing in infrastructure and social programs?
Yeah. Well,
you remember the peace dividend talk during the first Bush administration? It caused a massive panic in the military-industrial complex in the United States because enormous numbers of corporations made almost all of their money selling weapon systems to the Pentagon. If they downsized, it would cause massive unemployment all over the country. There was a panic and a scramble to come up with a new enemy. And they said, well, we can't be China because that's 1 billion people and they'll kick our ass. We need an enemy who's the right size, who we can go up against. So you remember the war on terrorism kind of started to came out of nowhere, sort of erupted right around that time. We thought, what if we could make little countries be scary? Oh, those little countries, they're coming to get you. They're going to blow up your school, because we could beat little countries, we figured. So we remanufactured US foreign policy so that instead of going up against the great bear of Russia, we'd go up against the scary, scary terrorists who could be everywhere. They could come out of the woodwork. Oh my God, you don't know where they are. But
why is it that a general like Eisenhower warned us about the industrial complex, the military? I mean, it's like
he was sick of it. He was sick of it.
Yeah,
he was going out of office.
It.
He'd had it. He was fed up.
Yeah.
You know, people will say things at the end of their careers that they will not say in the middle of their career.
Yeah, right. No, that's right. That's true. Well, let me actually get to the other point. I was just addressing that.
I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, my other point is like, like, while I don't agree with Hegel totally, I generally think he was very important. And I think that many people think he was a critic of Kant, but I don't think he was. I think he was offering an alternative to Kant to get out of the metaphysics and transform it to culture itself.
Yeah.
And I think he made a kind of general argument. I don't know if he made it straightforwardly, that he was trying to say philosophy, let's put it that way, rather than metaphysics. That by incorporating into the culture, it seems like it was important because culture always go through, at least in historical terms, this sort of evolution or transformation, the period when you're sort of in the middle of it and everything seemed like everything's fine. But philosophers are really needed in periods of transition, because at least for ordinary people, maybe not philosophers, at least for ordinary people, we have no idea how this other thing is. Mm-hmm. And so you have to have people that are able to at least have some idea of building a bridge between the now and the then, in order to create at least some soft landing into the next era. And I think while maybe we could sort of poo-poo philosophy doing the middle when everything is like just the way it is, like who needs deep thinkers, everything going smoothly. In periods of transition, you desperately need them, because you have to be able to see other frames of reference, other perspectives, other points of view and all that. And maybe not that you could get it exactly. So philosophy, in a sense, offer you a way to not maybe get it correctly, but to be able to build a pontoon bridge across the river to the other side when the regular iron bridge had fallen down. I mean, I think that it's just so important to have this broader context to deal with the transition, when it's needed. I think the problem is in the period when it's in the middle and everything's going fine, everybody forget about it. Like, oh, we don't need it. Our practical people will take care of it. Our bureaucracy will take care. Everything's fine. So I think he makes a really important argument. The philosophy is a key that should be kept rather than like sloughed away, and other sort of like segmented understanding is good enough. No, it's not good enough, because you have to have some comprehensive understanding in order to build that.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, the problem for the US existentially is that for the second half of the 20th century, we pitted everything, all our international and domestic policies were based on the idea of the great dance between the Russia and the United States. And that would prop up our military spending, and therefore prop up our economy, where our economy had become, I don't remember what the full proportions are, somewhere between 25 and 50% of our economy is selling munitions and other resources and services to the DoD. If the DoD downsized, we'd go into not just a recession, we'd go into a depression immediately. We've been mainlining the military. The reason we don't downsize after our wars, the reason we're always eager to get into another one, is the last thing in the world most of these companies want is an end to the wars. They want wars at the right level, not too hot where everybody dies, but not too cold so that they can't justify military spending. The centripetal and centrifugal forces that Stephen keeps alluding to, they apply to this as well. The US wants to right size military spending. And so for that to work, the only reason that the population will go along with it is if they're scared. And the problem that we were having with terrorism is it turns out that you fight terrorism better with investigative services than you do with large armies. Like if you don't know where the terrorists are, it doesn't do you any good to have giant bombers, right? You ought to be investing more in CIA agents and FBI agents and police officers and people doing the legwork to figure out who's making bombs. So the stopgap of terrorism didn't really work all that well. I mean, we're not going to give it up, but it just doesn't work all that well to justify the DoD spending. We really needed to get Russia to be hostile again, so that we wouldn't have to try to take on China. And because there's just nobody else that's at our scale, that's at the right level to justify our spending.
But even in terms of China, for instance, embracing China, I remember the ping pong diplomacy and all that, and I thought that was a good thing, and it is a good thing in a sense. That was a technical move of actually utilizing China as the counterbalance with us in relationship to Russia. Right. I mean, to the Soviet Union. Right. So that was a technical move. It was a more philosophical understanding of creating a new world order, so to speak. It was just sort of a technical solution. And then, of course, once that's solved, we're well, the business world just tripped over themselves. You know, there's another market to develop, exploit. Of course, they didn't realize that China was also using the counter strategy of exploiting that relationship. I remember Deng Xiaoping, what's the difference between a black cat and a white cat as long as it catches the mouse, right? And what he was doing was really, in a sense, we are going to be the crouching tiger that lay quietly until we build up strength to really maneuver. And then we have created, in a sense, another disaster. Not that we shouldn't have helped the Chinese. Okay, I mean, I think that's okay, but we use it as a technical move of the balance of power rather than in a sense really creating a world structure of sorts.
The most valuable thing that Americans could learn to help them understand current events is to understand that China and Russia and India and many of the other largest countries in the world all agree about what the biggest problem in the world is today. It's the United States. And the reason that that's the problem is that we're bankrupt. We have a gigantic military. We're used to using the military to solve our problems, but in a way that drives our bankruptcy further. And the last thing in the world that you want is an economically desperate nation that's armed to the teeth and that's used to using that military to solve its problems. Because sooner or later, somebody's going to push the button. Somebody's going to do it because they'll do it out of an economic panic, just like Germany turned to Nazism and fascism out of an economic panic. We are a pressing, terrifying problem to the rest of the world. And whatever else is going on in these other countries, you have to understand that, Putin and all these other leaders talk to each other about us and say, what the hell is going to be done about the United States to keep us from destroying the world? As we're in a late stage empire that's falling apart, and we're bitter about it, and we're half in denial, but half acknowledging it at the same time. And I think that the image that scares the world and ought to scare us is how many times in Florida when there's a hurricane, is there some idiot in his shorts out there with an automatic weapon shooting at the hurricane? This happens over and over. We are so used to reaching for violence when we're in a panic. It's why the suicide rate among women in the United States is mostly driven by things like poison, but among men, it's mostly shooting themselves. Because when we have a problem we don't know how to solve, we want to shoot a gun. And so how is the US going to solve its problems as things become more economically dire in this country? The answer is Everybody's afraid that we're going to solve the problems by picking a war sooner or later, not a well-considered, well-balanced war, but a panicky war that causes World War III. That's what everybody's afraid of.
What that actually sounds like the Soviet Union, the late stages, but they did not push the button. Which is sort of in a way surprising in a way, you know.
Because they had Gorbachev. We
Right.
lucked out.
Right.
There are any number of other leaders we could have had in the Soviet Union at that time that could have led to disaster. Like, I don't know what would have happened if Putin had been the leader of Russia during the breakup of the Soviet Union.
Oh,
right. Gorbachev was a different kind of guy. But at any rate, so we're stuck in these circumstances. You know, getting back to the core of today's subject. I mean, next time we'll go back to the text, but after this break, it's understandable we wanted to do some meta discussion. So Phil, earlier you were talking about irony of the modern condition. So let me see if in the last 20 minutes I can paint a little picture of another one of the things that drives at a core myth that moderns have about themselves that's utterly, obviously false, but that almost all moderns believe. I'm talking here about survival of the fittest. We have this idea that capitalism produces a marketplace of ideas. So, and because the market is an ecosystem, right? It's ruled by the laws of evolution. And therefore, whoever comes out richest must be the most fit, and whoever comes out poor must be the least fit. And that modernism through the market or through its other mechanisms, all of which are mechanical, rationalized, mathematical systems of organization, behaves like an ecosystem to drive the creation of excellence and the elimination of weakness. We all learn this, whether we're taught it in school or whether we absorb it through the mass media indirectly or through pop culture. All moderns learn this idea. This is part of the core catechism of modernism, that modernity is the best of all possible epochs because we are the pinnacle of evolution. And because we're the pinnacle of evolution, that means we're the most fit. There is this circular logic that's built into it. We apply the model that allows us to pat ourselves on the heads. What's wrong with this model? Well, let's talk about a couple of things. First of all, evolution is only a theory of how species change over time. It does not describe anything else. It does not describe how software gets better. It does not describe how governments change. It does not describe how languages change. When languages drift, they are not evolving. We use evolution as a metaphor to cover any change that we want people to not oppose. We say, what are you, some kind of heathen? Are you standing against progress? This is evolution. You can't oppose this change. Whatever is good. Whatever change happens is good because it is evolution, and evolution creates superiority and progress. Now, none of this is legitimate evolutionary theory, not any of it. Like, one of the things that any modern evolutionary scientist will tell you is that fittest doesn't mean better at all, not remotely, right? It is not a value judgment. It means fittest for the immediate circumstances at that moment. But if those circumstances are temporary, then the species that becomes the most fit is about to become the least fit when those circumstances change. We treat fittest as an abstract, eternal condition of superiority. As the most fit, I'm now the most fit for all things. You see how this is a child of Pico's theory of the protean nature of Homo sapiens. We can become anything we want. It is our infinite flexibility that makes us the most fit. But actually, if you look at evolution, that's impossible. That's the opposite. The generic species that could become anything is the least fit. It's the specific species that are keenly fine-tuned to the circumstances that are the most fit, right? We don't have the best teeth. We don't have the best claws. We can't run the fastest. We can't fly. All these other things that other species that are more fit than we have can do, we can't do because we're less fit than we are. We're more adaptable, which is a different thing than being the most fit. But we have equated them with each other for ideological reasons. because it satisfies our needs as moderns to feel like everybody before us was a primitive version of ourselves. Underlying all this is the 19th century notion of the Great March of Progress that leads from the horrible savages of the past to the fabulous, ecstasies of the modern intellectual who is better than all people who have come before him and sees the world as it truly is. Underneath this pseudoscience is this dogma that is about rationalizing and justifying anything we do. Since it is the new thing we did, it must be an evolution. And therefore, since it's an evolution, it must be superior. In this way, you can't question anything that we do because everything we do is progress in action. And you see how it becomes an ideology of passivity that encourages us to just accept whatever's happening. It must be the will of evolution. This must be how our superiority manifests itself to create an even more superior us than there was before. And the result is that people all find themselves passive in the face even of gross injustices. Even the Holocaust was argued as being evolution in action. That is how it was sold. It was sold as these primitive, corrupted bloodlines and genetics of these inferior peoples mustn't be allowed to contaminate the beautiful purity of our superior selves, or else we will devolve. Again, that idea of evolution as a line from the bad to the good. If our bloodlines are contaminated, we will devolve into primitives and lose our superiority in the world. All of the ideological framework of the Holocaust was based on this exact same misconstruing of evolution as applying to whatever we want it to apply to that we still use today. This is one of those things that we really don't want to think about, that we still have the core Nazi ideologies. We just took the swastika off of them. We took the anti-Semitism off of them and other things. But if you think about the way that people treat the homeless, the way people treat beggars, the way people treat the losers in this economy, you don't even have to scratch the surface. There are whole channels dedicated to screaming in your face, they're inferior. We're superior. We won. We're the winners in the great contest of evolution that is modern society. And as a result, it would be wrong for us to change conditions to give them housing, because that would contaminate our evolution and then we would devolve and lose our supremacy in the world. All of this stuff is still alive and well in us. So here's the thing. If you think that modernity is an ecosystem, then you think it is the laws of nature themselves dictating what's right and wrong in modern society. And then it leads you to think that, for you to go against them would be like trying to fight the laws of gravity. It would not only be morally wrong, it would be stupid. But if all of this is a fantasy, if all of this is an ideological self-justification, if there's no evolution at all occurring in the structure of the marketplace or in the relations between nations in the modern world, or between 150 years ago, who ends up a slave and who doesn't end up a slave, if it has nothing to do with evolution, then it completely changes the moral evaluation of right and wrong and how we should act in the world. This isn't just a little different. It is radically the opposite. If none of this is the will of nature or God, then it's all open to critique, and in some cases open to resistance or change. In fact, it might be our duty to act, to change unjust circumstances if they in no way reflect evolution or the laws of nature or anything else. And this is why it is so important to ideologues to keep reminding us over and over to assure us that, oh, it is evolution. It is about survival of the fittest. You shouldn't question that. Don't worry your pretty little heads. The laws of nature will take care of these problems for us. No actual injustices could possibly be taking place because this is nature's will in action, and nature knows what's right and wrong. You see this conflation. Now, I'll tell you, I misuse the term evolution in these ways all the damn time. It is the natural idiom of 20th, 21st century science that we call anything evolution that we feel like is evolving. If you go to GitHub, which is a great software repository where people work on software and make new versions and they release them, you will find people talking about their software evolving on almost every project. It is the dogma of this era that we can make things be evolution just by claiming that they're evolution. And at that level of analysis, we realize that what's underlying this goes well beyond ideology. It becomes simple nominalism and ego. The belief that we can redefine the world to be whatever we want it to be. And then everybody has to act along with us as though that's true. The level of incompetence about basic epistemology, what's true and what's not true, that's revealed by that nominalism, that belief that we can make things true just by saying it, it would be shocking to us and obvious if it weren't that we'd been marinating in this ideology our entire lives. To us, it's normal to talk this way. We don't even see the hubris at work in claiming that any change that we wreak on the world is necessarily progress, and that no one should question it because it's the laws of nature in motion. So this goes back to the premise of this book. This book wants to break us free from the stranglehold of modernity by exposing us to two other epochs and their ways of conceiving of the world, so that we can see, first of all, how alien they are. And then eventually we can come to see how each one, although it makes sense internally, when you step outside of it and look at it from the frames of reference from the other two epochs, you realize how arbitrary it is, and how many things that we took to be self-evident truths turn out merely to be ideology. The world can be organized very differently from the way it is right now, but as long as we accept the terms of modernity, that it is the truest expression of the laws of nature, then we are unable to even think in those terms, because we've already bought the premise, which is that it cannot be questioned, that it is nature's will. So we talked about the sources of meaning being God, nature, and man. And we talked about how in the ancient world, nature was preeminent over the gods, who were merely expressions of nature, and how man was subject to both of these. We talked about how the medieval revolution was the overthrow of nature, the argument that people do not rule because they are naturally superior, because the Roman Empire proved how corrupt many of our rulers are, that you cannot trust human nature, and therefore you cannot trust nature. The only thing you can trust is God. So they overthrew nature and said, now we will be ruled by God, and man will serve God, and man will be the custodian over nature. This was the new triumvirate, the new hierarchy of meaning. And moderns, after 1,000 years, said, oh my God, that led to the worst corruption of the church we've ever seen. God didn't, in fact, prevent us from corrupting the church. God may be incorruptible, but for whatever reason, he's not intervening to prevent us from creating enormous rot. So that didn't work. So we should overthrow God as a source of meaning and say, how about if human beings just solve their own problems? We'll have man on top, and man will wield nature as his pantry and toolkit. And then we can hope to seek out God on our own, on the side, in church, but it'll have no part of governing us. We said that when we did that, that man was taking onto himself the mantle of God and God's authority, and taking onto himself the mantle of nature and nature's authority. This was the core point I wanted to make in these last 20 minutes. When we casually assert that our invasion of Granada is evolution in action, when we casually assert that we brought civilization to the savages, all of this is claiming that human ego is the same as the laws of nature. What I have chosen to do is as inevitable as the laws of evolution or the laws of gravity. Literally in our minds, this is not just a poetic figure of speech. literally in our minds, we have taken on the authority of the laws of nature and ascribed them to mere acts of ego and confused them with each other. So when Kenneth Smith says moderns are uniquely confused about the world in ways nobody ever has been before, this is part of what he's saying. We don't know where we leave off and nature begins. We think that the things we have godlike capabilities, like being free from character limits, being free from, we think we can choose anything the way a god could. And we think that our actions carry the weight of the laws of nature. And it's not just a few egomaniacs like Putin or Napoleon who think that. We all think that. But most of us never notice because we're never given enough power for the full consequences of these deeply broken beliefs to manifest themselves in the world. If we ever want to make a better world, we have to turn and confront this core problem of modernity. Otherwise, we'll just continue to act out the core fallacies of modernity in revolution after revolution. Phil, then Jenny, then MJ. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, this is the exact point that I disagree with Hegel, although I admire Hegel a whole lot. I mean, he did say I think that the objectivity of the spirit, it distinguishes, of course, the individual spirit, the national spirit, the world spirit, and absolute spirit. We haven't gotten to absolute spirit yet. And I was studying, this group was studying with a Hegel expert, and Hegel did say, well, at least in the early 19th century, that German culture was the highest expression of the world spirit.
Yes.
And as such, and I sort of objected at first, well, this seems to state the whole idea of colonialism is justified.
Sure.
And then I said, and then later on, Hegel said, and because of this, at this moment in time, this particular culture, maybe he shouldn't restrict it to Germany, but Western culture has the absolute right to rule over the world.
Yes.
Right? And the other nations have no right to object. Said,
right.
Well, that really frustrated me, of course.
Right.
Now, maybe I shouldn't be frustrated because he was talking in the 19th century. And then I pointed out, if Hegel believes that things do evolve or change in time, it's not that he doesn't have the right because it is the most advanced stage, but I really objected to the word absolute, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And I objected to the word absolute because when you manifest the absolute, then are you not constraining, stifling, or even truncating this other possibility that might itself later on become the dominant idea?
Right, right.
So that's contradicting your own idea of things changing.
That's right.
And you're sort of situating this moment as the moment that will continue to rule, right? And maybe, like I said, if it's really absolute and really truncates it, that's it. You have no rights. If it's not as efficient, then it's sort of like at least slows it down.
Yeah.
And I said that sounds like a contradiction. Even if I gave it all the benefit of the right, you have the right to rule the world because you're at the most advanced stage, but not the absolute right that truncates the future. I mean, that's insane. Because how did Germany or Western culture, at one point, it did not have the absolute right.
Yeah.
But it managed to sustain itself and then eventually evolve into a higher level.
Right.
And so it just seems like, well, no, so this is the part, like I said, I really admire him of bringing culture to, in a sense, mediate against the sort of domination of metaphysics, and the philosophy should sustain. But that, I think he made a mistake there. And I think that's the part I disagree with, despite many things that he is very good at and very exhaustive at explaining. But that's a big mistake in my part, my thought about him. So
I'm with you. Hegel made a lot of mistakes, and it's easy to overlook them because the insights he had were so shocking and profound. But, you know, frequently Hegel's worst mistakes are things that he himself should have seen according to his own philosophy. There are places in which he failed to question things that his philosophy told him he should have questioned. And this was one of Nietzsche's big criticisms of Hegel and a lot of the other philosophers. He said, when you're part of the system and you're being heavily rewarded by the system, it discourages you from thinking about certain problems with the system. Because if you think about them, you'll be inclined to question them, and then you'll be cut off from the rewards. The better you're doing under a system, the more you'll have blind spots about that system specifically. This is in the modern parlance of privilege and marginality. This is the great problem of privilege. Not the old definition of privilege, but the specific technical definition, is that the privileged person has blind spots that are all related to the privilege. And Nietzsche, being Nietzsche, didn't express it in those terms. He expressed it as a moral failure on the part of Hegel and other philosophers, Schopenhauer, even after, I forget who all he went after. He had a long list. He had a laundry list of people. He said, you all were being rewarded by academia, and that's why you never criticized academia. So as being the center of a highly successful civilization, there are ways in which he couldn't question that civilization. There are questions he should have asked. And he took for granted a lot of the basic racism of the 19th century. How could someone be exposed in Chinese philosophy only to the I Ching and conclude from that it was impossible for the Chinese to be philosophical, and then to make up the reason that it must be their writing system that prevented them from thinking philosophically? He went way out on a limb based on very limited evidence, and his own thing should have discouraged him from doing that. He was doing noesis, right? He was drawing rationalized conclusions without a rich experience behind it. So, the things that you're critiquing, I critique in Hegel too. And there's a lot more to critique besides. But I think that the hoist on his own petard that is the most ironic in Hegel is that I think he's the source of the quote, the owl of Minerva only takes flight with the fall of night. That it's only towards the end of civilizations that the greatest philosophers arise, because it is the stresses and frustrations of the late stage of an epoch that drive people to look for answers. And if he had fully taken that to heart, he would have looked at himself and said, I am not at the end stages of modernity. Ergo, there must be major philosophical areas that I'm not seeing correctly.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah,
that is a
I know what you mean.
Inevitable
That's the same thing as I said, at the late stages is what you need philosophy.
Yeah, right. He was basically too early to fully apply his own ideas even. So anyway, thanks for that, Phil. Ginny, go ahead.
Well, I really enjoyed what you said for the last 10 minutes, 15 minutes, Rick. I mean, really enjoyed it, enlightening and all that. But I must tell you, with the advent of modernity, it sure is nice to have a cell phone and be able to Google all day. I mean, I do have to say, yes, I would not want to go back and live in the Middle Ages or when there's any other period. I do like my phone and Google.
I don't have a cell phone. I do not have a cell phone.
But you have a computer. I'm looking right
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
So just wanted to add that.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that however much we may be winning or losing and therefore more fit or less fit in the modern order, all of us as moderns are extremely well, what do I want to say? This is our culture. It may be an anti-culture, it may be dysfunctional, it may have a host of problems, but this is the terms in which we think and value the world. And if we were dumped into medieval or ancient cultures and expected to survive, we would not thrive. People would not be making decisions that made sense to us. Resources wouldn't be allocated in ways that made sense to us. Our range of motion and choices wouldn't make sense to us. This is, for better or for worse.
I started out my life in a very undeveloped rural Korea where there was no electricity, there was no plumbing.
Right.
And I was a child and I enjoyed my life collecting dragonflies and all that sort of thing. But would I want to go back to that life? So there you go.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the thing, another knock that people have against Kenneth all the time is, well, if you're criticizing modernity, you must hate it. And he's like, no, I only hate the stupid parts. It's like the thing about modernity is, like any other organism, it is a mixed bag. And it's not the enemy. It's just that it needs a lot of criticism and it's allergic to it. So I guess I'm going to have to be the one to say all the negative things. And then people will think that I only think negative things about it. But c'est la vie. Everybody else is saying the positive things, so I don't need to say those parts. They're said. Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that everyone's talking here like history is some tame little animal that's going to do what you want it to do.
Yes.
And I view each individual human being is really a bit like a bullet. It gets stuck in the gun. If it's lucky, it hits its target and then spends the rest of eternity as the piece of, what's the back piece of the ammunition called? The
cartridge.
The shell.
The cartridge.
The cartridge is just spat out of the gun, and this seems to be the life of a human being. I mean, you look at all the sperms that want to meet its egg. Each sperm figures it's privileged to meet an egg.
Yes.
Most don't make it. I mean, I think Monty Python must have got that joke in their song, that they realise that's the problem of the sperm. Yeah,
every sperm is
I just love that sequence with the Uber Morlock in the remake of The Time Machine, where he's explaining his philosophy of life, and the time traveller just won't. And he says, "Well, who are you to argue with evolution?"
Yes.
Here's a question for you,
please,
Rick.
Please.
You might have come across the legend of Gleipnir in the Norse mythology, the special rope that was used to bind the Fenrir wolf. Now, I first heard that riddle from a Norwegian back in the late 70s, and I never really thought about it. And after about 35 years, I started to think about it, and I came up with the answer, what it is. Yeah. If you've ever come across that legend, here it is. I put it in the thing. Yeah, what is Gleipnir? Here's a test for your mind, Rick. Can you come up with the answer? Because I came up with the answer.
I don't have it, and I haven't thought enough about it. Go ahead, tell me.
No, I'm not going to tell you.
All right, then I'll work on it. I
want to see what you come up with.
I'll work on it.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, well, that's it for this time. Next time we'll go back to the text and carry on. But
where are we at in the text? I mean,
so in the text, we are after the quotes from Black Elk and Demetrius of Phalaris, and we're before the quotes from Gilbert Murray and Max Planck.
Okay.
So we're in those 4 paragraphs. That's where we're going to pick up next time, and we'll definitely get to the Murray and Planck quotes, because they don't just set up the text that follows, they also illuminate the text that comes before. And all of this is about the centripetal and centrifugal that Stephen shared about, what is it that holds a civilization or a culture together, and what is it that makes it fly apart, and how do people contribute to one or the other or both? That's our theme here. So
thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Rick.
It was good. It was very good. Thank you.